Hello, everybody. Today I'll be speaking with Divia Eden. Divya is a stay at home mother of four children who she's unschooling, and also an owner of four pets who she's involved in training. She is a longtime member of the Less Wrong rationality community, and by my estimation, has been relatively influential in the thought of this community in ways that are somewhat hard to describe or make legible. Well, Divya, welcome to the filing cabinet.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I guess I have this perception that you're interested in something in the space of like some topic that is both adjacent to like dog training and like child behavior and also human motivation. I'm wondering if you think I'm right that there's like one thing that is sort of adjacent to all three of these things. And if so, can you tell me like how you got interested in it?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. I do think there's one thing that is well described by the things that you're saying. And I guess I would think of it as like some of the low level ways that minds tend to work.
Hmm.
And so I would say I'm quite interested in it with adult behavior also, but I think that tends to be like there are more abstractions going on with adult behavior than with either a dog or cat or a little baby or something like that. And so I think that looking at it with those types of agents lets me see something that is harder to see with adults.
Okay.
And yeah, and you're asking how did I got interested in this?
Yep.
I don't know. I think there's something that's always seemed interested to me about it. Like I remember reading, this isn't super well connected, but I remember reading an article, I think as a teenager, about microexpressions, like the Paul Ekman stuff, and thinking, oh, wow, like I need to understand this in the same sort of way where it seemed like this is a low level thing about the mind that I haven't been tracking, but it seems actually potentially really important for my models and of practical importance also for interacting with people. So I think I don't know that I have an explanation for why I've been interested in that, but from there, certainly at a certain point, I read Don't Shoot the Dog, probably on the recommendation of some other rationalists. And I was super interested in that also. I was like, okay, there's clearly some there, and I want to understand it. And then, I got dogs and I had kids. And so then there was that type of practical importance there where I'm like, all right, all of a sudden I need to figure out how to live with these dogs and with these babies. And it's not necessarily easy to do that. And what sort of levers do I have? How can I understand what's going on? And I don't know. I kept reading and trying things and trying to figure out what's relevant, both because I want to understand minds and then with the sort of additional, and I want the practical value of having my life go more smoothly.
Sure. Yeah, how about we start with the pet angle?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, so so you mentioned you started off by reading like Don't Shoot the Dog. Yeah, can you first tell us for those of us who haven't read that book or even heard of the book, I actually have not heard of this book.
Okay.
What's the message?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So this is by Karen Pryor. I think maybe she wrote it in the 80s. I'm not sure, but it's a book about behaviorism. And so Karen Pryor, let's see. You've heard of Skinner?
Yeah. So I've heard of Skinner, but for those in my audience who haven't.
Sure. So he, I think, is like, I don't know, sort of the main early behaviorist guy and he did stuff. I'm not an expert on Skinner, but he did stuff with people and he did stuff with animals. And I think he may have been the first guy who was like, this is what operant conditioning is and this is how it works. And he did a bunch of experiments there. And he wrote a lot of it down and he had a bunch of students. Like, I think there are these people, Bob and Marion Bailey, and they did, some of it was practical work. Like, I think they ended up training, dolphins for like the US Navy, but also I think they had, they worked with people in circuses and stuff. So from the beginning, I think the behaviorists were sort of putting this stuff into practical use and writing it down. I don't think these theories were perfect. But anyway, so Karen Pryor, I believe what happened was her husband got involved with SeaWorld, and then they wanted to put on shows with the marine mammals, and they needed someone to train them. And I believe that they had Skinner's, some sort of manual of Skinner's, but that the other people there couldn't figure out how to make it work. And Karen Pryor had some experience training her own dogs, though that was sort of the more old school, like punishment-based training. And she, I think, was the one that read the manual and ultimately figured out how to train these marine mammals. And she had a ton of success. And the main thing I think she's the one that named it clicker training. And now it's sort of a big thing, especially in the dog training world. It's very popular. It's become a whole movement. And the idea is that the clicker, it's like a little mechanical thing that makes a click, or they use a whistle. It doesn't really matter, but there's some sort of sound that they call an event marker. And when the animal does something that they want, they make that sound, and then they give them the food.
Okay.
And it's a type of positive reinforcement training. There's a ton I could say about it, but the book, the sort of the thesis of the book is like, look, there are all of these ways to affect behavior. Some of them are sort of more intuitive for people to use when they set out to try to affect somebody else's behavior than others. And I would say her thesis is that basically the more positive ones are underappreciated.
Okay.
And there's sort of a manual of how to do them more.
Okay. So, yeah, what's an example of like positive ways to influence behavior or to shape behavior?
Yeah, so I think the basic thing is more like give somebody something that they want for doing what you want. So like with the dog, if you every time they sit down, you click their clicker and then you give them a treat, they'll start sitting more. This is a pretty basic example.
Yeah. So one thing that's like kind of non-obvious there is like there was a step where you also gave a clicker, right? Which is not like inherently like I don't super want to hear clicks in general.
Right.
So it sounds like that's like a part of the story that's like that might not be obvious.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily it's always necessary, but it's for the precise timing. So because the dog wants the food, but giving the dog the food exactly as the dog sits is sort of a logistical challenge. Whereas clicking when the dog sits and then giving the food right afterwards, the theory is that this is logistically easier. There's some additional theory that maybe the click is sort of a sharper, more unusual sound, so it's more relevant, something about amygdala. I don't know. People wrote some paper about that. I don't know how important it is. The event marker is the thing that people focus on more.
Okay. And how much does that... So, like, sometimes I hear of clicker training being used as, like, okay, you're going to associate, like, food or treats with the sound of the clicker, and then, like, maybe the dog, like, likes the idea of hearing a clicker. And sometimes I hear of it as, like, you can have, like, quite a large gap between, like, the time of the clicker and, like, actually giving food. And maybe, like, the clicker... I think people sometimes think of it as, like, the clicker can sort of substitute in for... Like, that can just be the rewarding thing.
I think it's complicated, and I've heard people say different things about this. I think the modern sort of latest theories at the Karen Pryor Clicker Training Academy is more like always give food after the click. But for example, the guy who now runs the Karen Pryor Clicker Training Academy, Ken Ramirez, he has a whole course on non-food rewards, and he has various theories about it. I'm also not like... I don't know. I have a lot of respect for what they do, and I'm also not sure how much they've tested all these things. Like, I think that some people, I believe at the University of North Texas, tested some of the ideas about whether the behaviors that happened between the click and the delivery of the treat ended up sort of getting baked in to the whole behavior. And I think the clicker trainers thought they didn't with dogs that understood the system. And I think they ran a study where it seemed more like they did. So I'm not sure that the clicker trainers have the perfect theory about how event markers work. And I bet they have a lot of knowledge that really is true, because they do achieve impressive results with animal training. But yeah.
Well, like, when you say impressive results, what should I be thinking of?
Oh, like, for example, a SeaWorld show where all the all of the dolphins are jumping at the same time or something like that. Or like there's some walrus that can make 7 different vocalizations when they give him a cue. I think of that as sort of like a magic trick. If somebody didn't understand operant conditioning, I think it'd be pretty hard to get that sort of thing to happen.
So I guess the thesis of this book is that people, at least at the time this book was written, were like underrating these like positive reinforcement methods.
I think that is a lot of her angle.
Okay. Yeah. Why do you think people were underrating them?
So I think it's an interesting question, and I'm not totally sure I even agree with the thesis in a very broad sense. Like, I think a lot of interaction is very positive between people, but I
Hmm.
do think there's something about when people are like, okay, I'm going to get this person to do this thing, or I'm going to get this animal to do this thing, where then they start thinking more punishment. And I'm not totally sure. I think with the dogs specifically, I've tried to look into this, and I'm really not an expert. I think there's some history on that. It used to be more like working dogs. I don't know. People would sort of try to train them, and then if it wasn't working, they'd just get rid of the dog or stop.
Hmm.
And they wouldn't try that hard to get to change the dog's behavior if it's sort of, yeah, if it weren't kind of naturally happening with the various methods they used. And then there was an influence from, I think, the military, where they were
Hmm.
more like, no, we got to do this more regimented thing. So again, I'm not an expert on that. I think that the military influence is related to the history of dog training. But in general, why people think of behavior modification of other people the way they do, I'm really not sure. I have some ideas, and I bet you do too, and I'm not sure. And one of the things is that I think with people also, and I find this very, I don't know, very odd, but there's this theory that if people are doing things in a more positive way, then it seems more manipulative. I've heard people say this. This is like a
Huh.
consistent complaint, which seems in some ways surprising to me, because if things are more negative, I would think people would object more strongly to that. And maybe they
Hmm.
do. I don't know. Another thing that I think is up with it is that there's something, is that in some cases at least, it's sort of cognitively easier to be like, okay, I know what I want, and the other person isn't doing it, and then I'm just sort of complain about it in various ways until I have what I want. And something that can be more cognitively expensive to be like, okay, what are the successive approximations of what I want? Because often a thing that, like, positive, if there's something that somebody's already doing, but they're not doing it as often as I want, then I can sort of reward them more when they are doing it.
Hmm.
But if there's something that they aren't doing at all, then that's where people use shaping procedures. And I think that's maybe less intuitive to people. But again, I'm not totally sure that's right, because in certain circumstances, I think it's very intuitive. So
Okay.
I'm confused.
Yeah. Yeah. That actually. I don't know. This might just be a tangent, but that actually reminds me of There's this experience when you're playing like games where an AI is like very very good at the game already. So like
Yeah.
chess is an example of this. As of when we're recording this, Go is an example of this, right? Where like you play the game and then like you analyze the game, and like your first pass analysis is just like get an AI, evaluate every move, and then see how well you did, right? And I think back before when the AI was doing this, like your first pass analysis would be like look at every move and think like, okay, what would potentially be better options? Like how could we like, you know, how could we improve on this? What should I have been going for? Um, Whereas when you have this AI analysis, like usually the frame is like, okay, there's a certain win probability at every point in the game, and like there's a certain move that you could make that deducts 0% from your win probability, and every other move deducts some number of percentage from your winning probability, and you want that deduction to be as small as possible, right?
Right.
And in some sense, like this should all come out to the same thing, right? And indeed,
Mm-hmm.
like I don't know, you can use these tools to like play out lines and see like, oh, here's a focus you could have, or here's a thing you could do. But like, yeah, I guess there's something about the frame of like, okay, there's perfection, and I'm like some amount underwater of perfection, that is like both a natural way to think and in some ways a little bit of a dispiriting way to think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess um related to why people were maybe underrating the power of positive reinforcement. Yeah, what do you think like we learn about basic mental motions from this fact that like things like clicker training like do really work?
So yeah, I will try to answer that with the caveat that part of my sort of investigation of this is that I've come to the conclusion that my best guess is that the clicker training theory is not a complete theory.
Okay.
And in fact, there are pieces missing, even though I do think in many cases, as I said, it's a very impressive practice. And so when I try to think about what will work, like what it tells me about brains that this stuff works, I think I want to be pretty careful to, I think when I first read this stuff, I was like, okay, I should assume that sort of the theories of this are just right. And I can sort of put a lot of, I don't know, like that can be like a load bearing concept for me. And increasingly I'm like, well, I'm not sure. I think I want to have those pieces be more solid.
Okay.
But I can also try to answer the question of what I think it shows us.
Sure.
And I think it's a little hard for me to know where to start. Like one of the claims that the clicker trainers make that I think is a pretty interesting claim is that the things learned under positive reinforcement basically generalize better, like they become more integrated. It's one claim. Another claim is that so punishment also, I guess people often don't make a distinction between punishment and negative reinforcement, but these things are, to a behaviorist, they mean something very different. Punishment is something that happens after the behavior that stops the behavior from happening as much in the future. Whereas negative reinforcement is something that is when there's something negative, and then when somebody does something that makes the negative thing go away. So like if it's raining and I don't want to be wet and I walk under an umbrella, my behavior of walking under the umbrella is negatively reinforced.
Okay.
Because I was getting wet before and now I'm under it. Now I'm not.
Yep.
And punishment is in fact a very unreliable way to change behavior, which I think everybody basically who studies this stuff would agree about. I think this is pretty consensus. However, negative reinforcement, I think, tends to act more predictably. And often these things both things are going on, because if there's some aversive stimulus that someone's adding, there's a point where it stops and a point where it starts. And the point where it stops may be punishing whatever happened before. And there's a point where it stops may well be negatively reinforcing whatever happened when it stopped. Does that make sense to begin with?
So the idea is that like if there's some sort of punishment happening, there are like two variable, like there's like, okay, something bad happened to start the punishment and something good happened to finish it. And like there are two things that I have to learn from that, and that's like maybe harder than like you just immediately get a treat and whatever was happening right then was good.
I'm not necessarily saying it's harder, and one thing I'm saying is that I think the punishment part is just is very unreliable. Like I think something that Karen Pryor says in her book, which seems to square with my experience, that if punishment doesn't work in a few times, it's probably not going to work, and a lot of the times it just doesn't work. Whereas negative reinforcement has a more predictable effect on behavior.
Okay. So why, I still, I'm not quite sure why punishment would be less reliable than like negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement or anything.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I have a question of like, does this square with your experience? Like, are there a bunch of things that you or other people do in life and then something that they partly don't like happens afterwards, but then they keep doing them?
Yeah, I think so. So partly... So yeah, I mean, one like thing about like the experience of punishment is I think often I'm like, well, soon enough I can be in a different context where you won't be able to punish me or something, or like maybe this isn't. I don't think this is how our relationship should be going. Maybe I should be punishing you instead or something.
Yeah. So I think there are a few factors, and certainly the more kind of, I don't know, complicated social dynamics are involved, like with two adult humans or even, two humans at all, then people care a lot about autonomy, which they can be like, I don't like this. I don't want it to be like this. And as you said, also punishment is somewhat fragile in that if the person applying it leaves, then people keep doing what they did before. But even absent those factors, I think the basic reason it doesn't work is that people have some reason that they're doing what they're doing to begin with. And often they think it's still worth it, even if something bad happened. And again, I think this is sort of a bad way to describe it, think it's still worth it, because it seems sort of cognitive, but I think in a way that I don't think it always is. But I think often if there isn't a replacement behavior, then it's going to keep happening, even if now there's this, and this is sort of a cleaner example than people usually get, but there's some experiment I was just hearing about with, I don't know, some type of bird. They did it before, and basically the birds could, there was some sort of contingency they set up where like the birds would do this thing where they would peck this thing and then it would give them this electric shock, but then eventually they would get the food and they would do it. Whereas they could, also just peck the thing and not get an electric shock and never get the food. And so I think this is a lot of why behavior can be hard to change, just because there's a reason that it's there to begin with.
Okay.
And unless somebody's providing an alternative, they'll keep doing it. And so punishment isn't constructive in the technical sense, where it doesn't provide, it can suppress a behavior that somebody was doing. Like, I think that's the mechanism, but it doesn't provide a behavior to do instead. And so it's sort of a crapshoot whether, okay, you've suppressed that behavior. Like, is that going to be stable? Is it the new plan is going to be that just doesn't happen?
Yeah.
Or it still happens. And now there's this aversive thing also.
So it sounds like it sounds like basic to this is some understanding that like there are behaviors and then there's like doing nothing, which is like not really a behavior. And like somehow it's sort of better, like if I'm doing something, like it's better to have a different thing to do than it is to like just be doing nothing instead.
Well, or at least there's some payoff from the original thing. There's some contingency that is in play in the original behavior. And I would, if somebody's ever done some, and this is sort of like the radical behaviorist view, which I don't know is exactly my view, but I think there's something to it, that the first time somebody does something, it doesn't necessarily make sense to think of it in terms of a contingency, but the second time it does. Something happened afterwards, and then it was reinforced, and that's why they're doing it again.
But you could say the same thing about like if you're doing some behavior and I want to reward you for doing something slightly different, then like I can imagine someone saying, well, the thing you were doing before, there was some reason you were doing it, right?
Yes. Yeah, no, totally. I think that's right. And so I think there are two the main distinction with the reinforcement, which is either positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, is that now there could be a new behavior in the repertoire. And that could either be stable or not. And this doesn't, and in some cases, I'll only, let's say, I don't know, I'm taking out the trash and you keep saying, oh, thanks for taking out the trash. And I like that you're doing that. And I'm going to keep taking out the trash. It could be that I'm only doing it because I like that you like it. And so if I came to learn that you stopped liking it, I would stop doing it. And that's sort of, there's something that's superimposed. But then sometimes it could be that you start saying, thank you for taking out the trash. And then I figure out that actually I prefer it. And that I sort of never had that, let's say, I don't know, I was the sort of person that never really took out the trash before. And so, I don't know, it was fine. I didn't have to expend much effort. But on the other hand, the trash kept building up and I didn't really like it. And now you keep saying thank you. And now there's this new thing where sort of now I'm used to taking out the trash. And I like that there's no trash now. And maybe I'll keep doing it even if you stop saying thank you. So I think, there are these two distinctions in my mind. One is it reinforcement? Is it constructive? Is a new behavior on the table? And then also, is that behavior going to be stable whether you keep rewarding it or not? And or reinforcing it or not? And I think with a more contrived reinforcement, or is there now some new equilibrium where maybe I'll just keep doing it regardless?
Yeah. So should I maybe think of it as like the cool thing about like positive and negative reinforcement when it goes well is like I can point you to a behavior which like you hadn't already thought of, and which is like a better idea for you also, and for me. And like maybe it's a better idea for you, even in the absence of like my reinforcement. Maybe it's only a better idea in the context of reinforcement, but like we're finding some new like win-win thing.
I mean, I think that's great when it happens. And I think something in practice that is pretty relevant to all of animal training. So I had a call once with a woman who is very involved with this stuff. She's a clicker trainer. And she was telling me, and she had worked with marine mammals. And she was like, look, if you want to teach, a seal to like, I don't know, do some trick, sort of like that is easier than you might think. And if you want, you take some food, whatever, the seal will probably do it. I think she was talking about seals. She's like, but what's harder than you might think is, okay, let's say you have a row of 6 seals and one of them is doing the trick and the other 5 of them are waiting calmly over there. She's like, that's the hard part, basically. And I think this seems right to me. And I don't know, I follow the dog training world, and in practice, it seems like a lot of what people want from their animals is for them to just chill out in a bunch of situations. And there might be some behaviors that they could frame it in terms of, but being calm really solves a lot of friction that people tend to have with their animals. I don't know if that squares with your experience.
That seems kind of right, yeah. or like definitely like if I think about the worst animal behaviors, they're like aggression or something, and
Yeah,
like
right,
normally they're like I don't know. Normally, if I see an animal being aggressive, it's not like their life is not usually in
right.
danger, right? And like being calm would just be better for everyone, probably.
Yep, I think that's right. And I think the second most annoying behaviors for humans are overly excited dogs.
Hmm.
Like that can be fun. Maybe
Yeah. Yeah.
in the right context, it could be good for playing and stuff like that. But if there's a dog that's not aggressive, but it's jumping all over people,
Yeah.
people don't tend to like that either.
Sure. Sure.
And so, and even if somebody has some other goal, like teaching their dog to do agility or whatever, my understanding, and I've not done agility with the dog, but from reading these different forums and books, is that teaching the dogs to do the agility tricks is, I don't know, it's something, but teaching the dog to be calm about the whole situation and the other dogs there and the new environment
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
is often more of the deal. And so I think in practice, what ends up being very relevant is teaching dogs or whoever to be calm in these situations where they weren't previously, which, as you point out, unless there's actual danger, this is basically just better.
Hmm.
And it's cheaper. It's like calorically cheaper, like on a pretty low level. The organism tends to prefer
Yeah.
doing easier behaviors, and so it can be quite stable.
Yeah. Although, so I guess that's true in the case of like something like aggression. In the case of like hyperactivity or something, like you might really be more able to interact with others if you're like more active and going out to people and like you know
Yeah,
like if I'm just like sitting in my room like piecing out or whatever, right? I might not get as much from interactions.
yeah, absolutely. But I think there are multiple equilibria here. And my guess is that in most actual environments with sort of randomly selected people, the dog that goes up to people and sits and makes eye contact and maybe
Yeah.
lies down and looks at them and wags its tail is going to get better and more interaction than the dog that is trying to jump all over people.
Yeah. I guess for one, because you can like as a human, you can like assess what's going on and like figure out like, okay, am I about to have an interaction that I like or something, rather than just like "Rah!"
Yeah,
dog
totally.
suddenly on my face.
And I think a whole big part of this is that when two people are calm and they have some interest in interacting with each other, they can do a lot of attunement type things where their communication bandwidth gets potentially quite high in a way that's pretty hard to do when one or the other party is either aggressive or scared or very excitable.
Hmm. So yeah, you said that like one of the tricky things was to get seals or whatever to like be calm.
Yeah.
Um, are there like I don't know? Did this animal trainer follow up with but here's the way to do it, or is this just like a mystery?
No, people have a lot of thoughts about how to do it, and I think it's a little hard for me to evaluate. So I tend to believe that people are sincere in what they're describing that they do, and I can often observe the results that they're getting. And I think I tend to want to sort of remain grounded in, okay, but I want to sort of make my own evaluations of which parts of what they're doing is load bearing. Because I think people don't always know.
Hmm.
It could be that they do know. It's possible I'm sort of approaching this all wrong and they understand it, and I should sort of trust their own idea about what they're doing. But for now, at least, my investigation is more trying to be really scrupulous about that part of it.
Hmm.
In part because when I sort of take the theories that I've read and I try to apply them, I often don't get results that are the same as these people get.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that makes me think, okay, well, maybe I'm sort of doing it wrong, but in the ways that I know how to track, I think I am doing what they said, and yet it doesn't seem like it's working for me. So perhaps there's something that they're doing that I am not modeling properly and copying.
Okay.
And there's there's a lot of stuff that's relatively new in terms of people's theories about this coming out of a group of people at the University of North Texas. They call it the constructional approach. And in particular, there were these people. So they have procedures for aggression and they have procedures for excitability that involve manipulating the contingencies of the social interaction in ways that often do seem to be quite stable afterwards. There's a lot I could say about that, but I'm impressed with what I've seen there, and it's been something I've been focused on recently.
Okay.
Should I explain the procedures?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so the first one they came up with was called constructional aggression. And this is actually, so I believe there was a description in Don't Shoot the Dog for fear that was very similar. And it sort of knew that they were applying it to aggression. But I'll first describe the case with fear as I remember it from Don't Shoot the Dog, where there was some animal, like, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, it was a bird or some hoofstock or something like that that's scared of people. And so like, Karen Pryor wants to train it with the food. But the problem is that the animal, she can't get close enough to the animal to even give it the food. It's too scared of her. And so she's like, all right, what do I do now? The reinforcer in this situation, the reason that they're leaving is because they want distance from me. So they have a bunch of like escape type behaviors. And so she's like, all right, what I need to do is reinforce the calmer behaviors with distance also. So she gets somewhat close to the animal and it remains calm, and then she leaves. Then the animal can learn, okay, if I stay calm, then that thing will leave.
Okay.
And then eventually, in the procedure she described, eventually she gets close enough to give it the food, and then she could do it. And there's at least one woman whose YouTube channel I've been watching who does work in zoos who describes having done this with multiple like flocks and herds of animals as a way to get close to them when, the zoo staff has not previously been able to get close to them. And basically, because behavior is somewhat variable, and she claims it even works with a group where she'll sort of observe the group, and when the group kind of calms down for a second, then she'll leave.
Okay.
Or she'll pick one animal that's calmed down, and then she'll leave, and then she'll keep doing it. And there's a thing that they describe, and so yeah, this is for fear, but it's also for aggression, because in most cases, aggression is reinforced by distance. The aggressive behaviors are being the idea is that the animal's uncomfortable with the amount of closeness, and it does some aggressive behavior, and typically this increases the distance, and that's why they keep doing it.
Okay.
And so the procedure basically involves, they set it up. So they originally weren't as careful about this, but they're trying to make it as humane as possible. So trying to figure out sort of the exact distance where the animal that's being aggressive or fearful can notice that there's someone there, and then they leave.
Yep.
And then they'll sort of extend that time. And if they see a new calm behavior, then they'll leave. And so they're looking for either duration or novel calm behaviors. And I'm sure there's a bunch of nuance to this. This is not a procedure that I have done myself. I've watched some videos of it, but due to the nature of that they're trying to keep it sort of as humane and non-stressful for everyone as possible, the videos actually tend to be sort of, it looks like there's not much going on, even though I think, it's because they're being very careful. And anyway, so what tends to happen after a while is what they call the switchover, where the idea is, and this just seems to be empirically true, that a bunch of animals, in fact, have inherent interest in interacting with people that are not actually dangerous. Because as you point out, of course, this wouldn't work if the people were then going to attack the animals when they got close. But in fact, they are benign, and animals are somewhat curious. And so eventually that can take over. And there's sort of self-reinforcing cluster of behaviors where they're being aggressive or fearful, and they're getting distance that way. And then there's this other cluster of behaviors where they manage to be calm, and then they take in more information about the situation, and then they call it the switchover, where it switches to a positive reinforcement contingency, where then all of a sudden, the theory is, if you keep doing this, the animal will eventually want to get closer to the person.
Okay.
They'll want proximity. And then, so that's one procedure. And this is a way to deal with aggression in dogs. Whereas there's a pretty common thing that people have done in the past, which is more like, okay, the aggressive dog sees a person that they're upset about, and then somebody gives them food. And the idea is, okay, we'll associate the person with the food. And I believe this can work. Certainly people have positive results. I think, again, there's always this question of, is it working for the exact reasons that they think it's working? Ultimately, I don't know. And I think that there tend to be a lot of variables involved in the situation of exact timing of when people are approaching, when people are getting the food. Is the food sort of calming the animal down? There could be a lot that's going on. That's more how people used to do it. And I think, I don't know, it's more common these days, at least in the circles I'm paying attention to try to manipulate these functional reinforcers. So that's something I would say about constructional aggression.
Sure. And was this the thing you were saying, like, was this one of these things where you were somewhat skeptical of, like, their story about which parts were load-bearing?
Well, I tend to think, I guess my more recent update is that if people are manipulating the functional reinforcers, then that's probably then I'm more convinced. I now have a higher prior that that's really the thing that's going on,
Hmm.
and that is really what's driving it. But I do again wonder about, I don't know, more sort of subtle things with body language. Are they going to be important or not? Like, it's pretty rare that people do, like, that same guy who runs Karen Pryor clicker training, I believe he has influenced the migration paths of elephants by trying to
Huh.
set up things in the environment to reinforce the elephants for going different ways, basically because there's some countries that will, that where there's a lot of poaching of elephants.
Yeah.
And so if they can change their migration path to avoid the dangerous places, this is like a conservation effort that a lot of people are interested in.
Okay.
Seems good to me too. Anyway, so that to me in some ways seems like a cleaner example because the humans are not there. Like the elephants don't see the humans when they do this. So I'm sort of like, okay, if that's what's going on and the humans aren't even there, it seems very unlikely that almost impossible that something subtle with body language is influencing the results.
Sure. So if humans aren't there, how is the idea that like there are some positive or negative reinforcers that are just like features of the environment and like you can like tweak them when the elephants aren't watching?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think they set up food basically in
Hmm.
strategic ways to change what the elephant's doing.
Okay. Oh, and I guess that kind of makes sense if poachers are also like leaving food to like
Yeah, I
bring
don't know
the
if they
elephants in
are.
the yeah.
I don't
Okay.
know if the poachers are, if they're just opportunistically looking where the elephants have been migrating previously.
Yeah. Or if they're picking places that like happen to have more food or
Yeah, or like this guy also told a story, I think, in a podcast about that there was some place somewhere where there were these polar bears and the humans wanted to scare off the polar bears, so they were shooting their guns not at the polar bears but like making a loud noise with their
Hmm.
guns. And he, I believe, told them to change what they were doing. Instead of just whenever they saw the polar bear, to shoot the guns when the polar bears were sort of sniffing anything that smelled like a human. So this is like
Hmm.
became more relevant. And again, I'm sort of like, okay, my best guess is that in that situation, his theory for what's going on is pretty complete, and it's unlikely that anything else is influencing the situation.
Hmm.
Just because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of bandwidth between the polar bear and the people, other than that they hear this loud noise and the timing of when it is.
Sure. Okay. So that was an example of like basically like manipulating these like I think you said functional reinforcers.
Yeah.
In the case of some I want to say aversive behavior like fear or aggression or like things where you kind of want it to stop and like you like basically the human is sort of the stick in some ways
Yeah,
or like
that's right.
proximity is the stick. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I think about like as you mentioned the case of like overexcitement or like your dog's like jumping up on people,
Yeah.
I'm wondering like how is there some way to extend it to those situations?
Yeah, they have a corresponding procedure for that, which they came up with later. And there were these two, I believe the story of this is there are two guys, Sean and Chase, I believe, and they were also working at the University of North Texas, and they were working with shelter dogs, and they were trying to train them to do some stuff. But they found that the shelter dogs they're working with were basically did not care about their food. In part, I think because they said that there was like either a law or a policy of the shelter. The dogs always had to have food available anyway, so they sort of didn't
Okay.
care about that food, but they did seem very motivated by the social interaction. And so they switched what they were doing to have that be the contingency. And so the way they have described their procedure, which is called constructional affection instead of constructional aggression.
Yep.
And it has two phases. In the first one, they call it the interaction guidelines. And the description is pretty simple. It's if the dog is jumping up or doing something else that would be considered undesirable, like biting or, like, I don't know, pawing somebody's face, then they stand there. And then if the dog puts, all of its legs on the ground, then they pet with one hand. And if the dog sits down or lies down, they will pet with two hands and the more relaxed that the dog gets, the more affection they give the dog without ever totally withdrawing it. This is a schedule that's called conjugate reinforcement instead of episodic reinforcement. And so it's supposed to be so the description is kind of these discrete things, but my understanding of it and my limited experience with my dogs is that sort of the smoother it is, the better.
Okay. Yeah, so when you say like conjugate versus episodic, is the distinction between like kind of this like smooth gradient of like more versus less rewarding stuff, and whereas episodic is like at the end of the some period you either won or lost.
Or yeah, though I don't think the period, it's sort of like at a certain moment we're going to try to pick out some behavior and, something will happen then.
Okay.
Whereas this is continuous.
Yeah, there's like as they get more like this, then you get more like that.
Yeah, like there's this one video I saw of them working with this dog that they adopted where the dog was biting them in a playful way while they were petting. And obviously they don't like that. And so they said what they did was when the dog sort of went to go bite them, they would just withdraw their hands. And as soon as the dog like sort of relaxed its mouth and went to stop biting them, they would go to pet the dog. And they sort of went back and forth. They described it as like their hands were sort of like moving with the dog's mouth for a while. And then they said the dog stopped doing it because, again, their evaluation of the situation is the functional reinforcer here is that the dog wants them to pet them.
Yep.
And they're sort of excited. And so they kind of, I don't know, they have some like want more interaction type of payoff from doing this biting thing. And so if instead they get more interaction from the calm thing, the dogs will switch.
Yeah. This kind of reminds me of this seems very similar to like reinforcement learning theory in the context of artificial intelligence, right? So
absolutely,
there's like, so for those who don't know, in reinforcement learning theory, the idea is like you have your agent like do something and like you give it reward for how good it does, and you're trying to like generate some like behavior that will like get a high sum of rewards. So like if you want a thing to solve a maze, then you can give it like negative reward until it like finishes the maze. And so like way to maximize sum of rewards is to get to the end closer. And like a classic result in a standard result in reinforcement learning theory is that you do better when you just have more rewards per unit time, and like immediate higher rewards are closer to like the ideal policy, just because like that's easier to learn, right? Like
totally.
if I only tell you good job once you've like won a Nobel Prize in economics, it's like very hard for you to figure out that's what you were supposed to be doing, right? Yeah, which leads me to the question. Like I'm wondering, like in this, both in this example and in general, like reinforcement learning theory is called that because I guess it was inspired by this behaviorist thing. How close do you think the analogies are, and like how much do you think like one can learn from the other?
So yeah, and I'm pretty sure you know a lot more about how it works in the machine learning than I do. So you may have some of the answer to this. I would say that one distinction is that, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that the 0 point with the machine learning sort of matters less. Like the difference,
that's
right? Whereas with the animals, there is something. I think the way it's sort of non-arbitrary about the 0 point is sort of like, okay, let's say absent anything else, it gets this type of input. Will it try to leave? Will it try to escape or avoid it?
Yeah.
And there's a book called Coercion and its Fallout. Coercion is one of those words that there's like at least 5 things people might mean by it. But one of the things that it's saying is that if people are trying to train something or interact with somebody in a negative way, I mean, it's a sort of extremely intuitive idea, but I think for at least for a while it was underrated, that this produces fallout, which is a bunch of avoidance behaviors or shutting down. And sometimes avoidance is like, I'm going to leave the situation. Sometimes it's more like, okay, I'm just going to sort of stop doing anything. So that's, at least that's one distinction I would make. I think there are a lot of analogies, but the thing about, okay, well, this is sort of an agent that has some idea that it could either shut down its behavior or leave the situation. I believe that is not analogous to the current machine learning systems.
Yeah, I think the closest. Yeah, I guess there are a few things that seem like they might be different. So one is like when you're doing reinforcement learning, you're starting off with just like some random way of like taking in observations and like producing actions. And the thing your reward is doing is just like making it so that so that your way of like taking in observations and producing actions is more likely to produce actions that lead to higher reward. It's not the case at the start of training. It's not necessarily the case that the thing like wants to get reward.
Right.
It's just like reward, like literally just reinforces.
Yeah.
Which may, or I guess depending on how behaviorist you are, may or may not be a difference to animals. And I guess there is kind of a 0 point in reinforcement learning, although it doesn't necessarily operate that way. But you can talk about like temporal difference error, which is like, okay, if your reinforcement learner had a like model of the environment, and sometimes they just explicitly do, if they have some model of the environment of like, what happens when I do an action, like what's the next state, and like how much reward do I anticipate getting, there is such a thing as like getting more or less reward than you anticipated.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
And on some reinforcement learning algorithms, like that can qualitatively change things. Although I don't think there's like a default like shut down behavior that would tend to be reinforced by that would tend to be made more likely by like negative uh by rewards that are lower than the prediction. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so I guess like that seems different.
Yeah, I mean, also, I think, and again, I'm not an expert on the modern machine learning algorithms, but I believe what the animals find rewarding is going to be more variable,
Yeah.
right? Because it's, like if somebody's using food, then I don't know, it sort of matters how hungry they are, for example. But again, it could be that, I don't know, people are using food, but really what started to matter, like thing that clicker trainers report, which is very different from people that are using more punishment based training, I believe, is that they tend to develop close relationships with these animals in a way where I think the social bonding becomes very relevant. And so, and in fact, this is another funny thing, which I think is probably something that distinguishes it from machine learning also. So, something that's becoming more popular, as far as I can tell, with the clicker training is basically to have the option for the animal to get the reward without doing the behavior also.
Hmm.
So this is something that I see a lot in husbandry training. So husbandry training it's one of the main things that zoos do with their animals. Like zoos mostly are fine to have the animals just walk around and do their thing, but they often have medical things that they occasionally need to do. Like it's very helpful if they can do blood draws, or if sometimes they can do ejections, or if they can brush their hair or clean their hooves, or like all that sort of stuff, right? And one way that people have been training this sort of stuff more, and also with dogs, is that they can get food for participating in the procedure, or they can just do something much easier, like go stand on a mat over there and get food.
Hmm.
And it certainly calls into question, like, well, okay, what's actually going on here? Is it really about the food?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's interesting, but empirically, the animals choose to participate. There's a theory about this. I believe there's like a Wikipedia page called contra freeloading, which is the idea that animals sort of like to work for what they're doing. I mean, I think there's something that seems intuitively right to me about that, but I'm not convinced that this is sort of a complete theory.
I'm also sorry, just to clarify, is the thing you're saying that like if I can either only give the animal food when they're doing the thing I want, or I can give them the food when they do the thing I want and also when they're standing on a mat or something, the second thing works better than the first?
So they're not doing the thing. It's sorry to clarify. Let's say like I'm trying to, I don't know, Dremel my dog's nails.
Okay.
This is something I do. So one way people could set this up, that people really do this, is they're like, okay, I'm going to Dremel your nails a little bit and then give you a little bit of food. Or there's some way that the dog can opt out, and it can be going and sitting somewhere else, or it could be just sort of turning away or whatever. And you also give the dog food for opting out.
Okay.
This is a procedure. It often works. They say that the trainer has to be better, whatever that means. The thing they report is that they've tried this, and the skilled trainers, the animals will still do it, even though they could get the food anyway. Whereas if the trainer is not very good at training, whatever that means, I could speculate, animals less likely to participate.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess this...
And it certainly raises the question of, like, is the food really why the animal's doing it, right?
Yeah. It definitely... Yeah, one thing I was kind of going to ask is, like, yeah, in the reinforcement learning case, there's the whole world, and then there's your reward, which is, like, totally different from anything that's going on in the world, right?
Yeah.
But you definitely know what it is. Whereas, like, yeah, it seems like in the animal case, it's not always obvious, like, what things are actually reinforcing, or, like, what's like desirable for the animal in question.
Totally. And I think food is so popular because, I don't know, on some level, almost every animal wants food on some margin.
Yeah.
So it's sort of easy to use it, or, maybe they have their preferred foods. And this is another thing. Like, I believe Karen Pryor describes this in Don't Shoot the Dog, or one of her books, about that. It used to be, the theory used to be, okay, well, you have to sort of keep the animal hungry if they're going to work for the food. But she found that this was unnecessary. And in fact, they would do their training and they would give the animals the food. But then at the end of the training session, the animal got all the food anyway. Like whatever food like the total number of, fish per day did not change based on the animal's performance, but the timing did.
Okay. Yeah, that's. I mean, it also calls into question, the case of the animals getting food for opting out and this only working for skilled trainers. It sort of suggests that they're serious trainer effects, which makes me wonder am I going to learn anything by reading these books, or are they just going to be things that are maybe if I'm not very good at training animals, yeah, maybe I actually do want to keep them hungry, and or maybe it'll be more effective to keep them hungry and only feed them when they do X thing.
Well, yeah, and I think it depends on your goal, right? Because as I said, so something like husbandry, I guess, is sort of a whole cluster of things that is non-trivial and people tend to want and tends to be pretty important. But as I said, I think the larger thing that almost everybody wants from, say, their dogs is calm behavior and sort of good relationship. And if I'm trying to overall get my dog to be calm and have a good relationship with me, I think the one where I deprive them of food and then try to do something as a not very skilled trainer, my guess is this will backfire.
Yeah. So sort of, yeah, relating to this, to the domestic, the pet case. One way I sometimes hear it being talked about is that essentially you want to I don't know, you have some somewhat positive relationship with your pet, hopefully. Let's say you do. And then I sometimes hear people talk about training as opening up a communication channel.
Yeah.
The dog learns that the word sit means that they should sit down, and if you hold your hands like this, then they should jump through them, and
Yeah.
and kind of the game is not rewarding, convincing the animal that this thing is worth their time, but just setting up a language. I'm wondering
Yes, totally.
yeah, so to what degree, it sounds like you agree with it. Yeah, how do you think that plays in with the reinforcement learning story?
I think it's partly a good story and partly a flawed story, according to me, at least given the way people tend to train. And again, I'm not an expert on these things, but I believe that there's a study that I saw that, who knows if it replicates, but I tend to think it's right, that when people do obedience training for dogs in shelters, this does not improve their prospects.
Huh.
There's another study, again.
When you say their prospects,
of getting adopted by family and then not getting brought back to the shelter.
Okay.
I believe it doesn't help. They've tried this. This is a pretty easy intervention to try. And another case of this, there's an organization, I forgot what it's called. There's a book, it's Jennifer someone, Love Is All You Need. She trains service dogs. And they did some sort of internal study to try to see what was predictive of the service dog relationship actually working. And I believe that they found that the dog's ability to respond to cues was not predictive. So again, I think that there's something to this. I think the goal of, okay, so you already have your animal, you like each other, but you want to have higher bandwidth communication. I think that's a solid story. I think the question of, does traditional sort of training with food tend to actually result in sort of higher bandwidth communication in the ways that people tend to actually want with their pets? I think it's pretty hit or miss. I think there's a story that people tell that it works that way, and I'm sure it sometimes does.
Yeah.
Does it in general produce that? My guess is no. My guess is something. My guess is that it's sort of taking the radical behaviorism so far as to explain attachment theory is really the thing that then becomes predictive. I think what people, and I've heard this from at least 2 dog trainers. This seems right to me, and the woman who has this service dog organization says this, and a woman who invented another technique called behavior adjustment training, which is very similar to constructional aggression training. I don't have to go into that. Her latest thing also is to talk about attachment theory for dogs. And again, I think it comes down to reinforcing these little sort of micro communication behaviors. And I think the main prerequisite for that is both people being calm. I think when the human is calm and the dog is calm, then they can become attuned to each other and their communication can develop. And in fact, teaching these cues might get people there and it might not.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one way it could make you more calm is like if you can like teach your dog cues or whatever, then your dog becomes more predictable to you, which is presumably like a way in which you can be somewhat chilled out. I guess depending on how like unpredictable the dog was previously.
I mean, I think that's right, but I think sort of to go back to what this trainer was telling me about the seals and the doing the trick versus sort of sitting there, I think the types of behaviors that people tend to want to make their dogs predictable have calmly or like they want a long duration. Like for example, let's say the dog is jumping all over you and you're like sit, and the dog sits. Is the dog sitting really tensely and kind of like, okay, as soon as somebody stopped telling me what to do, now I'm going to start jumping you all over you again?
Yeah.
Does it make the dog more predictable? I guess a little, but I think not very much. And if the cue is, okay, I say sit, and now you sit calmly for a period of up to like 5 minutes, that's very hard. In my experience, that's not easy to teach the dog in some sort of simple, like, okay, I read the Don't Shoot the Dog book, I have my clicker, I have my treats, and now I've taught the dog that. I think it's actually quite hard.
Yeah. And definitely, like, if you, like, a standard thing you might want from a dog is, like, we're going to go on a walk and, like, please roughly be with me and, like, don't cross the road when I'm not noticing and stuff like that, which is, like...
That's right. Yeah. Dog trainers say this is one of the top things that people want. It's like they would call it loose leash walking, but I think your description is good. Like people to have like a chill walk with their dog outside where they basically are with them. Most people don't need them to heel or do anything very precise.
Yep.
And again, I think the most important thing there is basically that the dog is calm, and almost anything the dog does when it's calm will be okay. And that if both the dog and human are calm, eventually they will learn to have higher bandwidth communication on the walk. And almost anything the dog does when they are not calm will be stressful for the human.
Yeah. Which includes like, so there's calmness just like of, you know, you're outside going on a walk. There's also like calmness in the response of surprise stimuli, like another dog has crossed the road or there's a cat in the bushes or something.
Absolutely. Yeah. Any sort of sudden change, it's very helpful if the dog can sort of take that in stride also.
Yeah. I'm curious, like, how good are training techniques at, like, this sort of generalization of calmness to, like, suddenly there's a cat where, like, presumably it's going to be difficult to train that because you can't arrange for that situation to happen much.
No, I think people do, in fact. I think in fact that, so I imagine dog trainers vary in quality. The ones that I either have worked with a little bit or have anecdotes about, my guess is they're very good at what they do, and they have a bunch of ways for dealing with this. Certainly in terms of books I've read and conversations I've had, sometimes they do in fact involve doing setups with, I mean, it's a little harder with a cat, though I can imagine doing it, but it's very common for a dog trainer to use their dog as like a decoy dog and practice these situations.
Yeah.
Either that, or they'll set up, they'll say, okay, here's sort of the plan, and we're going to go somewhere where dogs will kind of predictably appear, and then we'll train it in that situation.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Seems like a way of doing it. So one thing you mentioned earlier on is like there was clicker theory, and you had like some reservations about whether it worked the way that people said it was. I'm curious if like has that been covered during like the previous conversation, or is there like more you want to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would summarize by saying certainly there are some people that are very good at doing what they do, and I tend to wonder how much of the things that are not described by the theory are load bearing, in particular the sort of their body language, their movements, stuff like that. And it's not like they never talk about that, but I don't know, it's sort of not centrally a thing that's part of it. And then also my personal experience, and I'm really not sure I'm right, is that basically the conjugate reinforcement schedules are sort of underrated theoretically, and the episodic reinforcement schedules are overrated theoretically. And there's a little bit of work on this. Like somebody sent me, one of the constructional approach people I was talking to sent me a paper about, I believe it had babies and they were kicking something to make an image appear.
Huh.
And they found that if it was sort of episodic, like they kick and then the image appears for a while, and then they kick and then it appears for a while. I think that was the way the episodic worked. I could be remembering the details wrong. They didn't figure out how to do it. Whereas they set it up so it was more continuous. So the more they kicked, the brighter the image got. And the more they stopped kicking, the image faded. The babies learned this basically immediately.
Okay. Yeah. So actually, like going along with this transition from animals to human babies. How much is it like should I just think like there's a thing of like how all animal brains work in human, including human brains, and like by learning about like reinforcement for dogs and like orcas or something, I'm gonna like basically get human brains right. Versus how much is it like no, like human babies are like really different, and you've really got to specialize there.
No, I think there's a lot in common. I think the difference basically with humans, as especially as they get older, is that they have more abstractions that I'm going to be missing something if I'm not modeling them.
Okay.
But I think the low level stuff is seems similar to me. I mean, there's some people like I think I don't know, my inner this group of people called the critical rationalists, like David Deutsch, they follow Popper and stuff like that.
Yep.
And I think they would be like, well, there's sort of this sharp distinction between reasoners and non-reasoners.
Hmm.
And I actually I put some stock in that potentially, but I think that there's nonetheless a low level layer that operates very similarly.
Yeah, yeah. I should say, I actually could have done this episode with my mom, but my mom both spent quite a while like when I training dogs and like teaching dog training classes and like taking dogs to nursing homes, which is like kind of fun. Calmness is at a
Yeah,
premium there. Uh, and also was a high school teacher for a while, and she definitely reported that like there was a lot of skill overlap.
totally.
Yeah,
Sort of thinking about it, I think the sanity check of does this seem like it would work for a person is, according to me, somewhat underrated in understanding dog training too.
yeah. What's an example of something that like you think
So
fails that
like
sanity
I think
check?
there's sort of maybe a naive theory of reinforcement where it's like, okay, assuming I give somebody food every time after they do something, they'll just sort of keep doing it more and more. But I think I think dog trainers wouldn't really say this because it just obviously doesn't work. But I think imagining, okay, well, let's say somebody kept giving me food every time after I don't know, made a particular muscle movement every time. Like, would I just keep doing it more and more? I think the answer is no.
Yeah. Do you think that it ends up being overrated? Like presumably like people who are training animals like spend a lot of time with them, right? And like notice like what things tend to work or not. Do you think like the comparison with humans is like still underrated like once you condition on like, I've noticed like what it's like interacting with this animal?
Like the thing I was just saying.
Yeah. Well, either that thing or, like other examples you have in mind.
I mean, I don't know that it's underrated in a practical sense. Like, I think if people spend a lot of time with a particular animal, they'll develop a very good model of that animal and they'll tend to do a lot of things that will work.
Hmm.
I think in producing a more complete theory, there's a question of like, why is that working? And I think there's a good sanity check, which is like, okay, well, if that's why it's doing, would that theory predict that that would sort of always happen in all situations, whether it's for a different animal than this individual or for a human
Hmm.
animal? I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think
Yeah, yeah. I think that makes sense. Like, I guess combining with some other stuff like theorizing is often the hard part, or like identifying which parts are important.
I
Especially
think
in
so.
domains where like the load bearing parts can be like body language or things that are not necessarily easy to like describe in text or something.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, and people also talk about this in terms of like these I think they call counter conditioning procedures for fear aggression. Like, okay, if let's say that you were, I don't know, you were hanging out and then some guy appears with a gun pointed at you, like,
yeah.
is it does it seem intuitively helpful if I'm offering you a candy bar? Let's say you like candy
Hmm.
bars. I think many people use this one. Like, this isn't, I didn't invent this example, and people's intuition is like, no, it doesn't really seem like maybe a little, I don't know, but probably not. That's not really what I want.
Yeah.
Whereas if it seemed like whenever I don't know, I did something, then that scary guy with the gun would go away. Does that seem intuitively like it would affect my behavior? I'd be like, yeah,
Hmm.
that does seem intuitively more like it would affect my behavior. So
Sure. So, yeah, moving, I guess, a bit back into the human realm. I'm curious if there are like I don't know aspects of like animal training stuff, or maybe like things closer to the human domain that have that you found useful or like insightful in the process of raising kids?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think a lot of it really does apply. And again, I think that I hope it's soon. I think one day somebody's going to connect up all these ideas to attachment theory and then it'll make more sense. And it hasn't happened yet. But so something that I've noticed a lot that I didn't have, I think this has helped me refine my concepts around. So with my, I've had 4 kids now, and with some of my newborn babies, they did this thing I found so surprising at first, where it took me a while to even name it this. I was like, okay, it seems like they want to nurse, but then they also don't want to nurse.
Hmm.
And they get very upset. So, like, one of my babies, let's say she's tired. I'm like, all right, okay, it seems like she wants to nurse. I'm going to like, and then I get close to doing it. Like, she can tell that that's what I'm going for. And she starts screaming.
Huh.
I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And then eventually she sort of finally gets tired enough that, like, I sort of keep trying and then back off when she starts screaming. And then eventually she'll nurse and fall asleep. This is a common experience that I've had. I think not, I'm quite sure not all babies are like this, because one of mine really wasn't like this at all.
Hmm.
And when I've asked other people, it seems like some babies are like this and some babies are not. And this is something where the reinforcement learning lens seemed pretty relevant to me when I sort of got that more.
Hmm.
I'm like, okay. And with adding in the thing that I think that the babies are conflicted, which I think is, again, is the thing where sort of it's easier for me to use my intuition pumps about human behavior because they can explain themselves and I can introspect and all of that.
Hmm.
I think that there are sort of multiple contingencies going on where, yes, there is part of this baby that wants to nurse, and that's positive.
Yeah.
And then there's some other part of this baby that wants distance. And that there's this sort of cluster of behaviors like the screaming that are reinforced by distance. And there's this cluster of behaviors, like rooting, which is it's like when babies move their heads from side to side. I think it's a built-in, like one of the, I don't know, dozen or so infant reflexes that indicates that they do want to nurse.
Hmm.
And it starts out as a reflex, but then it certainly becomes reinforced, becomes more under their, control of more of their brain. And so, yeah, that theory was very helpful to me, because I'd be like, all right, okay, so it seems like even though on net, maybe I don't know. I think I used to more have a model like, okay, well, if the baby wants to nurse, maybe I should sort of try to get the baby to nurse, because it was very reinforcing for me when the baby would finally nurse and then would fall asleep and would seem a lot happier. But with my last baby, I'm like, okay, so he's doing this thing where he's screaming, and I start to notice the precursors to that. Like, all right, he's sort of turning in this way and he's kicking. Let me walk away from him. And sometimes that he would get calmer, and I was like, oh, I didn't really realize. And it's not totally stable to just sort of leave the baby, obviously, because on net there are all sorts of the things that the baby wants about me being near there. But if I can use this theory of that, if I give distance, that there's some, like, modeling it as like there's this part of the baby that has distance as a functional reinforcer. And insofar as I give it distance whenever it wants, then it will sort of calm down, and eventually the sort of wanting will more take over. I don't know if I'm making sense. This is one sort of concrete thing that I really did manage to figure out, is to how to resolve my baby's conflicts about nursing more. It's like not a perfect system, but basically by giving distance in a way that's similar to the constructional aggression procedure, it seemed like it helped a lot. And this had not occurred to me. It was not initially intuitive to me to do this.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
I give a totally different example also.
Yeah, let's hear another one.
Okay, so another one, so there's a sort of common problem for toddlers everywhere where they seem to want to touch things that their parents don't want them to touch, right?
Yep.
And initially, I don't know, I just didn't have as fine-grained model. I was sort of like, okay, when they sort of draw back from it, then I should do something reinforcing, like maybe get really excited or clap or whatever. And then, but when they keep doing it, then I should sort of stop them or something, or I don't know. I found this very hard to manage. And eventually, in the long term, I think basically everybody learns, to talk and to communicate more and to be calmer. And this tends not to be a long-term problem, but it does tend to be a challenge for a lot of toddlers. And once I had these theories more in my mind, I'm like, okay, so it seems like the part where, like, yeah, I could try to clap and get excited and be like, yeah, you left that thing alone. But ultimately, do my babies care about that? Eventually, sort of. And it seemed more relevant to me to be like, okay, but what is the functional reinforcer in this situation? Is, well, they want to investigate the objects. That's why they're doing it. They're not doing it because they think, I mean, again, initially at least. Maybe eventually they start doing it because there's some payoff to the sort of way that I try to stop them from doing that. I think actually that sort of thing is quite common. But I started paying more attention to the timing. Like, okay, my baby's reaching for the dog water to, dump it out, which I'm not a big fan of. And I try to block him. But the minute he draws back, I stop blocking him.
Okay.
And which has not produced any sort of overnight super dramatic results, but it works a lot better than what I was doing before. When I was thinking in terms of sort of larger behavior chunks. When I'm thinking, okay, like just as he goes to like get it, I will stop it, which I think he finds mildly frustrating, but that's sort of already part of the situation that was there regardless, unless I just let him dump the dog water. And then as soon as he draws back, I stop blocking him and he gets a better view of the dog water. He can, I don't know. So that is a different example where I found this type of thinking pretty helpful.
In that case, if the functional reinforcer is investigation, like how much do you think that can be satisfied by looking at the thing versus like poking it a little or like actually manipulating it? Because
I mean, I think not completely. Like, I think ultimately, like, in the long run, I think there are a bunch of ways, and I'll try to like also provide other opportunities to play with water in situations that I don't mind as much.
Sure.
The bath, and then eventually, I think as babies get older, it becomes both true that we could have sort of better communication about like, here's a way that you could fulfill your desire to investigate, and the sort of desire to like fit in with the other people and act in ways that are sort of more like socially harmonious tends to also become a higher priority.
I'm wondering, so like for this example, like sort of the key insight was like figuring out what the functional reinforcer was. And
no, I think the key insight was the fine-grained timing.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I want to talk about that anyway.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
But I don't know. One thing that's been sort of on my mind is like, it seems like an important aspect of these things is like figuring out which things are actually reinforcing, and maybe which things are functionally reinforcing, or which I guess I haven't. Does functionally reinforcing just mean like more reinforcing in a given situation, or?
So it's possible that I'm not using the word right, but the thing that I think it means, I'm hoping I'm saying this right, is as opposed to a more contrived reinforcer, which is basically being superimposed on the situation from someone who wants it to go differently.
Yeah. Sorry, okay, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's not obvious. It's not totally obvious that like functional reinforcers should necessarily matter more, right? Like in a bunch of situations, you can just like pay me money to do a thing, and like that wasn't necessarily part of the situation, but like whatever, I like money, and like
absolutely,
like the thing that matters is just like you might think that the thing that matters is just whether things are reinforcing, and whether they're things that are reinforcing that like would naturally be part of the situation. Like it's not so obvious why that matters, right?
Yeah, and I think I have two sort of thoughts about why that tends to matter. One of them is maybe obvious, which is that it's more stable if I can change the contingency with a functional reinforcer. Like if somebody's paying you to do something, chances are that unless you sort of learn something new about what you like, you'll stop doing it once they stop paying you. And that might be fine. In many cases, a bunch of the world works on people being paid to do things.
Yep.
And it's fine that they would stop if they weren't being paid. And then again, the other one is that I think in practice, what I want is from my children is more like being chill. And that in fact, I guess there's an empirical claim that I am making that often the functional reinforcer, it's sort of a low dimensional thing. And that manipulating that is at least a big part of the thing that I more want, which is the calmness.
Do you think like, so if I think about what the micro foundations you could say, or like why this is being treated differently, do you think it's something like you just care more about the functional reinforcer, or is it like it's a thing on your mind?
I think
more?
Sorry, no. I think it's that when there's somebody's adding a more contrived reinforcer, then it tends to be more like that part of the person still wants to do whatever they wanted to do before, and that now some other part of them wants this other thing. And they're less likely to be calm if they're sort of overriding what they want in order to do this other thing, as opposed to if they could just have a more chill relationship to the original thing. I don't know if that
Okay.
makes sense.
So should I think of this just actually as like trying to find these like pointing people towards win-win situations where like no, you can get more of like the thing you wanted out of this situation, like the functional reinforcer, by doing this other behavior, and like the fact like you're pointing them towards that rather than just like providing some other reinforcer to like get them to temporarily do what they want. But like, you know, absent your intervention, like it's still the case that their best strategy for getting the thing that they were aiming for.
Yeah, like I'm not sure if there's some dog that's like frantic to jump up on people because it really wants social interaction. I'm not actually sure that it's possible to, like, certainly if I have, I don't know, some like meat that the dog really loves,
Yep.
I'm confident I could get the dog to lie down to eat the meat instead of jumping on the people. I'm not confident that there's a way to get the dog to actually be calmly interacting with people without actually changing the contingency of the social interaction by just adding the thing with the food.
Hmm.
And I'm not totally sure that it's, again, there are people who have training methods where they're like, okay, I'm using the food to get the dog to lie down, and I'm, giving more food when the dog breathes deeply, and I'm trying to reinforce the dog for being calm even while this person is over there. And I'm like, okay, maybe that's what's really going on. But I guess I'm skeptical that it's possible to really get there without also manipulating the social contingency. And I think sometimes just by doing the things with the food, it gets it into a more self-reinforcing loop where then, okay, it sort of manages to be a little calm to get the food. And then it notices that, in fact, when it's calm, it can still get the social interaction with the people. Like, I think it can sort of bootstrap that way.
Yeah.
But I think it tends to involve changing the contingency of the functional reinforcer, or the animal is going to be conflicted, basically. And I think being conflicted is not being calm. With some caveats, like I think people can be conflicted in a calm way, but like as a first approximation, I think there's something there.
Sure. Okay. It seems like one important thing is just figuring out like which things are reinforcing and which things are like the functional reinforcer. And like I'm wondering how obvious does this tend to be in the case of like humans and kids, and like I don't know, is there anything interesting to be said about like figuring out what actually is reinforcing?
Yeah, and I think I am not at all an expert in this, but I think I am sort of developing the sense that this is often lower dimensional than I think, or like there are sort of, I'm sorry, I think ultimately it's high dimensional in terms of what do people care about, especially like an adult human with all sorts of concerns. But if there's some sort of behavior that's coming to my attention that's kind of like then I should assume that probably there's something pretty low dimensional about it. Like, again, with the aggression or the fear, I think it makes sense to mostly model this as animals wanting distance. And I think like I don't know, the world could be different where I had some different prior where it's something about the exact way that I'm moving or what, I don't know, like it could be something else, or it could be that it's something sort of different every time. But it seems like in practice for many of these situations that once I identify, it's sort of simple in retrospect. And I'm like, okay, it was really just that one thing. I don't think it's always like that, but my sort of trying to investigate these things has led me to think that it's more like that than I would have necessarily thought.
Okay. Yeah, so one thing that can be said about reinforcers is how like simple they are. Another thing that can be said is like how obvious they are, or like obvious in
Right.
retrospect. And I guess you're identifying both in that.
Yeah, I mean, obvious to me, I think I started paying more attention to is just micro physical movements, like that. I mean, it sounds like a lot of these things. I'm like, okay, people just, a lot of this is just common sense, but I wasn't necessarily noticing it.
Sure.
But if there are little ways that somebody's moving away from something, that's probably what they don't want, and there are little ways that people are moving towards something, it's probably what they want. So, like for example, these people with the interaction guidelines where they pet the dog more when it becomes calm.
Yep.
Something that they talk about is often that I think this part is not as specified in their procedure, but they'll say that often it turns out that the dog wanted a particular type of petting or like petting on a particular type of the body. Like they have a podcast and they had one, I think about some dog where they're like, oh, if we pet it on like the inside of its leg, that's what the dog wanted, basically. And that's when the dog would calm down. Whereas if they pet it in other ways, it just didn't seem to matter as much. And it's like, okay, and
Yeah.
I look at that and I'm like, well, how did they figure that out? And I'm like, okay, well, I think the way they figured that out is by sort of by experimenting and just trying different things, and sort of by, while having some prior that it was a type of sort of social interaction, probably touch, that the dog wanted.
Hmm.
And also my guess is that they noticed what is the dog subtly moving away from and towards.
Yeah. I mean, in my experience, like, dogs will definitely just, like, bump you with the part of their body they want. Like sometimes they're not subtle about this.
Right. And I think they tend to be the best at it when they're calm, and they have a history of this working with people, and they learn because, like, again, with a calm dog and a calm human, if the dog's like, I'm going to bump you with, this part of me and now you'll pet it, it works. Whereas the dog is jumping all over you, it could still be true that there's something very specific that they want, but I think it's harder to figure it out.
Yeah. I wonder, like, how, okay, maybe this is like a spurious connection, but I wonder how much of this is like just allowing your sense of what the dog wants to be like conjugately reinforced by the dog's behavior.
Yes, I think that's totally right. And then it's like, okay, well, what is, I don't know, we could dig into it more, like, what exactly is that? But I think ultimately, yes, these sorts of things are mutually reinforcing. And they're these little sort of like, I think attunement is this state of like fully, of really synced up mutual social reinforcement. And there's some work on this, which again, I'm not super familiar with. There's this book, Interaction Ritual Chains, that has a claim that when people are in an attuned state, the timing of certain things, certain social things going on is very tight, like to the point where it wouldn't work to do it over a video call.
Which does match my experience of video calls being somewhat worse than being in person.
Yeah, and I think this author gets base points for predicting this before video calls were popular. I think he was like, people are gonna find it less satisfying because you can't get the timing as good, even in theory, just because of the latency.
Yep. Which is to peek behind the curtain, listeners. This is why I care a lot about guests having wired headphones. It like really matters a lot, I think.
Oh, interesting. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, speaking about this, like, kind of mutual, like, social reinforcement thing, one thing you mentioned a couple times earlier is like attachment theory, and like how that is related to, I don't know, all of this. For those like me who are not actually like that on top of attachment theory, what is attachment theory?
So yeah, and despite theorizing about this a bunch, I probably am going to mess some of this up. Apologies to the people whose work it is that I am misrepresenting. But there are at least some things I know about it, like that there were these experiments people did with social behavior of like human toddlers, for example, of things like, okay, so let's say they're with their caregiver and then the caregiver leaves, what do they do? And then somebody else comes in that wasn't their caregiver, what do they do then? And now their caregiver comes back, what do they do? And they sort of catalog these different behaviors. They found that it's actually pretty similar in dogs to human toddlers, and that many of these same things seem to apply in adult relationships too.
Okay.
And so, for example, there's people talk about secure attachment, which seems like people are sort of confident that they can reach out and their bids will be met at least enough of the time, and that also if they want space they can get that. Whereas, and again, I hope I'm not messing this too much. Whereas anxious attachment, I believe, is characterized more by, okay, I'm not sure that the person will be there if I need them, and has certain associated behaviors. And avoidant attachment is more like, I'm not sure I can get the space I need if I need that space. And then there are more disorganized patterns where people might have both concerns, basically.
Okay.
And I think ultimately, like, these are sort of summaries that people can have a secure attachment style within, at least in a particular relationship. I think this is sort of on a per relationship basis, though people have some tendencies across relationships also. And, but that it could be somewhat contextual, and there could be, in my model, which I think is not as much part of the literature, people could sort of have different parts of their minds that might have different attachment styles, even though overall it might make sense to characterize their attachment style a particular way. There could be some sort of little microcosm where it behaves more like a style that I wouldn't say is their overall style.
Okay. And one way I've heard this presented is something like a 2 by 2 with maybe sort of continuous axes, where like one axis is like how confident am I that I can like get attention when desired, and how confident am
Mhm.
I that I can get like distance when desired.
Right.
Which like would present it as sort of a spectrum, or to me, it would sort of suggest it as being like some sort of spectrum thing. Uh,
Mhm.
you could also imagine like no, they're like sort of discrete like equilibria behaviors or something, where like
Yeah.
there's specific things. Those specific things might have subtypes, but like you're actually more likely to be one or the other rather than like halfway between. I'm wondering like out of those, which seems more right to you as a depiction of what's going on?
I think I think there are attractors that make it more discreet than it might be, though I think which sort of attractor, like I think it's ends up being more continuous because in the range of situations, people could sort of like probabilistically be in one attractor or the other.
Hmm. And like you
Man,
can,
I don't know that I really meant probabilistically. I mean, sort of across situations. Like, there's sort of like maybe, okay, I have a secure attachment with my husband, but like, okay, now he's on a boat somewhere and I can only, really talk to him every few days. Is it still a secure attachment? Maybe.
yeah,
Okay, now he's in space and he might be gone for 50 years. Do I still have a secure attachment? So my guess is that there is some sort of continuous thing if I take the situations into account, but there are different attractors. So I think I'll go back to the constructional affection procedure also in these dogs, where they do this thing called the interaction guidelines, where they basically give them more social attention of the type that they want as the dogs are calmer. That's the first step of it. And they do have a second step, which is typically okay, so now the dog is calm when they're petting them. But if they leave, the dog's going to be at the door barking, come back, come back. Like
yep.
you can probably imagine, you've seen dogs like that. And so the procedure they do there is called an affection loop, which is pretty simple procedure. Basically, they extend this little, they sort of carve out this calm behavior where they get more distance for the animal. And
Hmm.
so they'll stop petting first for maybe like half a second, whatever it is, where the dog will remain calm. And then they'll keep petting the dog. And then they'll stop petting for 1 or 2 seconds, and then they'll keep petting the dog, and they'll sort of expand this until they can leave the enclosure. They do this with shelter dogs, and they've done it with a lot of them.
Yep.
They'll leave the enclosure and come back, and the dog is still calm.
Okay.
And then they can do it and leave the enclosure and wait for like 2 minutes and come back. And so some of these people that they are developing this, they worked on this with their dog who has separation anxiety. And if I'm remembering correctly, they worked on it up until about maybe 5-10 minutes of being gone.
Hmm.
And it had basically clicked. Then they went to go, I think, get their COVID vaccines, and they were gone for hours, and they had a video camera to see, and the dog was still fine.
Okay.
And so that to me suggests that something happened where the dog was sort of like, okay, I get it. There's some like thing where I can just be chill and they'll come back. And would if they stayed away for a week, would this work? Obviously not. So again, that's where I sort of come back to like, well, I don't know, situations are pretty variable. But
yeah. How much do you think this is like some sort of like learning, either in a cognitive sense or just in a like, creating different anticipations of like what's going to happen when the human is away for a while versus something that's more purely about just reinforcement of like, I don't know, calmness when the person is away for a little bit?
I think it's so the concept that I think eventually somebody's going to have some better theory about here
Hmm.
is something like object permanence.
Hmm.
And I think there is some sort of limbic, low level concept of object permanence that is distinct from a conceptual object permanence.
Okay.
That is my guess. In part because when I introspect on how I relate to certain things, there are things where I believe I have some sort of conceptual object permanence. But so, like an example people give is that there's a certain type of like internal tension that a lot of people feel when they have copied something, but they have not yet pasted it.
Right.
Do you relate to this?
It's definitely like a bit on my mind, or it sort of feels like it feels very similar to like I go into a room and I have this like half empty on a can of something that I'm drinking, and
Yeah,
there's definitely something tracking like, all right, something is going to need to be done with this can when I leave the room, either me bringing it with me or me
totally.
throwing it out.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, I guess with the copy pasting thing, there's more of a fear. There's more of a sense that I might forget, So it's maybe a
Yeah,
bit more
totally. And
tense.
And I think like conceptually, that until, like the copy will be there until you copied something else. But there seems like something that you kind of have to like maintain some internal tension, or the situation won't work out the way that you hope.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and also sometimes I like copy something and then I copy something else before pasting the first thing.
Yeah, totally. And it seems adaptive. Like it's not a complaint about it, but I think that there's some analog where the dog's like, okay, I got to sort of remain on the alert, and it could be sort of a bunch of extreme behaviors or not until that person comes back. And I think it can sort of switch into like whatever, like the person will come back. I don't really have to worry about it.
Yeah. Or
this is sort of an acceptable, like for example, so you're saying, and I relate to what you're saying about if I bring something into a place and I know I'm going to have to like, throw it away or take it with me. But there are environments where it's not like that. Like, I don't know. I have a water bottle here and I can close it.
Yep.
And I'm in my own bedroom and I'm sort of like, I don't need to keep track of that.
Yeah. It actually, like the object permanence thing, it sounds more like sometimes I'm in a situation where there's some like collection of things that are on my mind, and it makes a big difference if I can write them down versus not.
Right.
Partly just in terms of like how much tension or something like adjacent to anxiety I'm feeling about them. Partially because like when they're in your mind, if there's like more than 3 things, it can feel like infinity things.
Yeah.
Whereas
totally.
if there's a list, you're like, okay, that's all of them. There were only 4.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. So this like limbic object permanence thing, like when you say that, are you thinking of something that's like more? Are you thinking of something that's like responsive to just evidence about how permanent objects are? Or are you thinking of something that's like perhaps more responsive to like reinforcement or training or something?
More like the latter, though. I mean, that's a type of evidence, right?
Yeah.
Like when people sort of like I don't know, I could find like comics or something where people are there's some sort of sense that if they imagine being a baby that doesn't have object permanence, whatever that means, then they're like, oh my God, I don't like, do you even exist when you're not here? Like, my guess is that that's not really conceptually correct for what's going on with the baby. I don't think it's right that they have no idea that their caregiver exists when they're around the corner. I mean, it could be that I'm wrong and I'm imagining this all wrong. But I think it's more like they don't have some sort of stable sense. And again, I think that in the way that's more responsive to this type of reinforcement learning, that they can expect something fine to happen with respect to the caregiver if they remain calm. I think they're more like me when I've copied something, but I haven't pasted it. They're like, okay, caregiver's gone, got to remain on alert until the caregiver comes back. I think it's more like that.
Okay.
In a way that almost everybody grows out of.
Yep.
At least in terms of somebody going around the corner. Like even people with pretty anxious
Yep.
attachment styles as adults. I think it's rare to be freaked out when your partner walks, whatever, you know what I mean?
Yep. And I guess like maybe the converse of that for the dimension of like, wanting distance is presumably something like anxiety about like, will this person ever go away, or like how anxious do I have to be until like I get space from so and so, or
yeah, it seems
like
right
that.
to me.
Yeah,
and I think again, if I had to like think of what might convince somebody, it would be some analog of the constructional aggression procedure, where basically people come to have a lot of low-level evidence that they can be calm and get people to go away when they need it to happen.
Yeah. I guess the timing there is sort of like you sort of want to have it to happen on your schedule. So if I imagine
Absolutely.
like going
Yeah.
to a place where like I want to be away, like people who I don't want to interact with for very long, right? Like if I'm there for a whole 5 days and I know I've got a way to get back home later, like it matters to me like how long I'm there, or like even if I know eventually I'm going to be gone, right?
That's right. And I think with humans and also with animals, honestly, there's this other layer of it, which is there's these when an animal's like barking and growling and lunging, they're these really loud ways of getting distance.
Yep.
I think the more subtle way that I'm sure all of us engage in for getting psychological distance from people is something that's more like dissociating,
Yep.
or more like physically turning away from them or going to a different room or whatever. Stuff like that. And so yeah, there's, when you talk about the timing of like, okay, you're no longer sort of in the same house as them or something, I'm like, yeah, okay, cool. But also there's this thing where maybe they can tell that you want a little space and they're very responsive to it, even if they don't move fully as far away as you might like.
Yep.
I think that could be quite powerful also when they disengage in response to your subtle signs of discomfort.
At the start, I think you talked about you're interested in this as like relating to sort of basic mental motions, like a limbic version of object permanence rather than like I'm aware that objects exist version.
Yeah.
How basic do you think you have to be for this stuff to apply? Or like similarly, at what point of abstractions do you think like thinking about this style of like conjugate reinforcement and functional reinforcers and stuff stops being useful?
I can try to answer that, but if you can ask it in a slightly different way, I think I would like give an example or something.
I guess like at what point does like this kind of behaviorist like operant conditioning frame stop being like the most useful way of analyzing behavior?
Okay, so I think if it's the sort of situation where it's either me, so I can introspect, or it's somebody who is willing to introspect and tell me what's going on, I think it tends to be pretty useful even when there are a lot of abstractions in play. So this is sort of a whole different thing, but a different main area of interest of mine that actually I think is super related is internal family systems therapy, the idea there are all these sort of different parts of my mind.
Yep.
And I think if I'm trying to analyze how do the different parts of my mind relate to each other, I think this stuff is super important.
Okay.
And if I'm talking to someone else who's willing to sort of introspect on a moment to moment basis, I think, again, it tends to be in play quite a bit. On the other hand, if I'm sort of treating the other person as more of a black box, I think at that point, my model is that it's still happening in a bunch of different ways, but it's more like, well, all their sort of different parts are reinforcing each other in these different ways. And if I can't model it, it's not necessarily a useful lens for me to use to predict their behavior.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. I'm wondering how it interacts with like, so earlier on you mentioned something like abstraction as like an obstacle for, at least for easily understanding behavior in terms of like
for this type of
stuff.
analysis.
Yeah. I'm wondering like do you think that's just because like when people are doing abstraction somehow like you have like more abstract concepts that are the reinforcers and like they're just more abstract concepts, or do you think it's like abstractions built on top of like it's still the basic reinforcers? Or
so I think it's a pretty good analogy to something like physics. Where I'm like, can I use physics to predict what you are going to do? And I'm like, well, yes and no. And on a very small scale, I expect everything going on in a human being's body to be predictable using physics, right?
Or if I'm at a trampoline park, like
yes, or right, exactly. Or if you're at a trampoline park, and then I can sort of model the whole system using some pretty basic physics. But let's say what you're doing is, I mean, if I'm like, who are you going to podcast with next? Can I use physics to figure this out? I'm like, no, basically.
Yeah.
And then there's some things that are a little sort of more in between where I'm like, oh, I don't know, even you're riding a bicycle and I want to understand what's going to happen next. Can I use physics? I'm like, well, I mean, it certainly seems relevant, but not in the same way that you're bouncing on the trampoline park, or not in the same way that if I'm trying to understand whether, I don't know, your finger is going to get crushed. Like, I don't know, it sort of matters. The different, like, I think the physics is always there, but whether it's a useful way for me to analyze it, maybe there's some sort of complexity theory kind of question. Like, probably somebody has some good theory here. And I think of it as the same thing with this operant conditioning.
Yeah. Oh man, can I give you a little tangent on this topic?
Yeah.
So I don't know. One thing that is kind of fun to observe is like, so I like magic tricks, just like as an art form. I think they're great. But in particular, like one key thing about magic tricks is that somebody has to do something that you think is like basically impossible, right?
Right.
And so a way, I don't know, kind of a very basic way of categorizing magic tricks is like, what alleged law of the universe are they violating,
Right.
right? And sometimes it'll be like very basic physicsy things, right? So like, I don't know, some like woman starts levitating, and you're like, ah, hang on, that's not supposed to happen, right? Like people are supposed to fall.
Right.
But very often, like I think the very classic card tricks, they do not violate known laws of physics. So like if I shuffle a deck of cards and I like give you a card and you look at it and then you shuffle it back in and I pick out a card and it's the one you saw, right? Like uh on some like very obvious level, it's not like gravity broke.
Right.
It's not like it's not a failure of object permanence. So object permanence is, by the way, like in terms of basic physics, it takes you a while to get object permanence or like object impermeability, right? So like if I
Right.
push a pencil through my hand, like it actually takes a bit of physics to say like why is that supposed to be impossible, right? But
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
a lot of a lot of magic tricks, the thing they're violating is like many layers on top of basic physics. But
Yes.
apparently like it's so like fundamental to how people think that like it's still very surprising when somebody violates some information theoretic guarantee or something. Uh,
Yeah, totally.
yeah. So I guess that's
No, I like it.
yeah yeah I think this is an underrated way of thinking about magic tricks. Um, anyway, I'm wondering. Yeah, so one way in the AI world we have of thinking about abstraction and like really complex behaviors in the context of reinforcement learning is like people sometimes talk about hierarchical reinforcement learning,
Right.
where like the simplest way of doing it is like instead of like actions receiving rewards and you change your probability of like doing a single like very basic action, like there are sort of routines you can do, like in the human case it might be something like go to the shops or like
Hmm.
or even like touch my head, where that's actually a very complex like bunch of like
Absolutely.
muscle
Yeah.
motions. um and like you have some set of those things, and it's not totally obvious how you get that set, but like somehow you get that set, and those higher level things end up being reinforced. And maybe there's a hierarchy of like uh the like touch your head action can be reinforced or not, and then within the touch your head action, like once you're doing that, your your lower level muscle motions can get reinforced.
Hmm.
So at least like this is the analogy of that. But I don't know, this is an idea that people think about in AI. I'm wondering, like,
Yeah.
yeah, in the case of like uh either animals or like humans, I'm wondering like how that ends up being relevant, or if you think like no, it's actually just one level of reinforcement learning. There's just like a
No,
lot
I
of it.
think it's definitely hierarchical. I think it has to be.
Yeah,
Because like if I look at, I don't know, like a baby or a really young animal, like babies can't even, like they're just so, their muscle movements, they don't know how to do them in a coordinated way
yeah.
until eventually they do, and then they have these larger chunks.
There's some they can
Like,
get right, but like little babies, they can like grab your finger if you like put them in your palm.
so yeah, the things that they can initiate, but I believe that's one of the newborn reflexes
Yeah,
is when they have feel something on the palm of either their hand or their feet, they grasp. And they're, again, I think they're like on the order of a dozen of them. I couldn't name them
yeah.
all. And I think those are the things that people start with. And then after that, it does seem like they basically learn them in a sort of reinforcement learning type way. And then there become these hierarchies where, eventually they're like, okay, I'm going to grab that. And it's not like there's no, at that point, some of what I guess that means is there's no longer any sort of smooth reinforcement gradient for like, the individual muscle movements. Like they don't get what they want at all until they've grabbed the thing and like brought it
Yeah.
to their mouth. Like it's not reinforced. Like,
Well, there's still some learning, right? So like I don't know, I work in an office, right? And the
mm,
office, you have to like uh tap your key card, and
yeah,
then the door unlocks, and then you can open the door, right? But like, well, at least for the old version of the office, if you like tried this routine the way I just said it, it would not work. Actually, what you have to do is you have to tap the key card. First, you have to wait for some sound to go. Then,
yeah,
instead of just pulling, you have to push the door a little bit and then pull, right?
right, yep,
when you first figure this out, there's like tap, push a lot, and then pull, and like you have very exaggerated motions, right? But I think like
Yeah,
as people do it more and more, like the motions get like smoother, subtler, more efficient,
totally.
and they also
Yes.
stick around. Like we recently changed which like area of the office we were, and it turns out you no longer need to do this push and pull routine, um, which I don't think I've fully adjusted to that yet. But like
Yeah, totally.
there's still some there's apparently still some reinforcement of like these lower level actions because
Yes,
people are
that's right.
changing them, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, and this again is, I sort of goes back to why I think these calm behaviors are more stable, is that I think people prefer easier things
Yep.
in terms of, expenditure of calories or cognitive effort or whatever it is. And so that's why these things become subtler and smoother over time,
Hmm.
because it's easier. And so I think there's some sort of margin on which animals are always like, okay, but can I do an easier version of this?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And sometimes I think people can get sort of trapped in some superstitious loop where they never figure out that there's a much easier way to do it. But I do think there's nonetheless that tendency that's pretty consistent.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, I think it's an intermediate. I think this can only be explained hierarchically. Like if I'm like, okay, so the first time, my baby puts food in his mouth, he doesn't know about food, and now he's like, okay, I like putting food in my mouth, and he now knows that if he reaches to get food, then that gets him closer to having food in his
Hmm.
mouth. But it's not like he doesn't have any of the food in his mouth. Like he can't taste it yet. Like he doesn't have it yet. There has to be some sort of hierarchical process where the reaching is being reinforced. Is like, okay, this is closer to your goal, right?
Hmm.
I don't know. That's how I would assume it would work.
That's how I would assume. Yeah. I think I think there's this classic story in the field of AI where you're a PhD student and you learn about hierarchical reinforcement learning and you're like, oh my goodness, this is like the way, like this just must be how everything works, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, we should definitely do this. And then like you learn that no, like it basically just the way we do it in AI just like doesn't really work that well. Like you
Okay.
just never see successes with hierarchical
Interesting.
reinforcement learning, and it's not really obvious why. Like everyone kind of believes that like, oh, if there must be some way
Huh.
we can fix it and like it's gonna work because like this seems like what people must be doing, but somehow somehow there's something we're missing.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
then that makes me think like maybe I'm wrong about how humans work too.
Well, it could be.
It certainly seems intuitive to me that that's what's going on. But I
Yeah,
guess
I think the
I
tricky
don't know.
thing is that like when you say like, oh, it's a hierarchical thing, like there's a lot of details to be done. Like how many levels of the
Mm-hmm.
hierarchy are there? How do they get set? Like how do you pick which things count as like lower level actions? Like how do they get shaped?
Oh,
Like there are a lot of degrees of
yeah.
freedom that like if you're doing like if you're writing the code, you have to set those, and if you set them wrong, then like probably it's not going to work as well as it could be working. Um,
I mean, I guess different handle maybe to compare and contrast is people talk about conceptual learning.
hmm,
And so, like that same guy, Ken Ramirez, who works at Karen Pryor Clicker Training, he's done a bunch of this where he'll teach dogs things like he could add like left and right to some cues that they already know.
hmm,
Like maybe they already know, like, go to your crate, or they already know, like, pick that up or touch that or whatever. And then he'll teach them like left touch and right touch,
hmm,
left crate and right crate. And eventually they generalize. What he says is that it takes between 3 and 5 instances before they generalize.
hmm.
And if they haven't generalized by 5, the thing to do is to sort of back up and like you probably did it wrong, not to keep trying more
Yep.
things.
And so that's like so I would initially parse that as doing a related thing of like introducing compositionality, right? Where you have this
Yeah.
like left and hang on, did they generalize in the sense of like you do left touch and right touch, and then you do like left heel and right heel, and they immediately know what the left and right things are? Or
Well, he says it's not immediate. He says
yeah,
you
yeah,
have to do between 3 to 5 examples, but then yeah, you could do some novel one like left fetch and right fetch and they get it.
okay, yeah, yeah, huh? It's
And he has some good stories about this. Like he taught some dog to like go fetch something with only verbal instructions inside a burning building and like get something out using these cues. I don't know, it's cool stuff.
yeah. I do. Yeah, I guess there's this interesting cognitive question of like how much like like how much towards just like the compositionality of human language can we get by doing this?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what the state of the art is there. Yeah, I think he also has said that there's some sort of other level of like once he's taught a dog, 3 to 5 descriptors, like maybe there's left and right, there's up and down, there's I don't know whatever else there is, smaller and bigger.
Yep.
Once he's taught a bunch of those, then of course they learn new ones faster.
Yeah.
I would think there's got to be some sort of limit in terms of like just the brain capacity.
Yeah.
And certainly it seems like, humans learn these sorts of things very easily over the course of not very specialized training scenarios, but then dogs mostly don't. So
can they learn like modifiers of the modifiers? So if I have like left and right, and then I introduce like or left heel and right heel and left fetch and right fetch and whatever, but then I introduce the very modifier for like very left fetch, very right fetch. Can I then use that for like very bigger or like very smaller fetch?
That's a good question. I would guess yes, but I don't know if anyone's tried that.
Okay.
So I would want to know.
Yeah. So yeah, actually relating to the cognitive capacity thing, I'm wondering, like, presumably you start off like with human infants, right? You start off with an infant, and like, there's like not a ton of abstraction going on, and like hopefully you can like model it using some sort of operant conditioning frame pretty well, and then like I imagine there's like more cognitive development over time, and it gets harder. I'm wondering if like there's like some like sudden transition or if there's a smooth slope, and generally like what does it look like in terms of like when in terms of like how useful the operant conditioning frame gets over time.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert in developmental psychology or anything like that. I think it continues to be useful, but just in different ways. And then I go back to the physics thing where I'm like, okay, I think if I want to understand exactly how my baby is learning to walk or something, to coordinate the muscle movements for walking, thinking of it, there's a lot about the operant conditioning frame that seems pretty useful. And I also think that if I take, I don't know, an adult who's trying to learn to play a video game, there's going to be a lot about the operant conditioning frame that will be useful, in part because I'm sort of like, okay, I guess I have some basic model that when a bunch of parts of a person, whether it's like their muscle movements or like something else, are sort of all coordinated, then I could sort of go back to, in some ways, like this operant conditioning thing seems relevant again. In the same way that like if you're all jumping in one big chunk of you at the trampoline park, I'm like, yeah, I'm back to using physics, just like when I was modeling some small part of you. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah. I guess I'm like, I'm curious for some insight into what it looks like, right?
Okay, so I think that one thing I would say is that imitative behavior seems to ramp up a lot in humans around 1. So like if I give a 6-month-old baby a shovel, I will expect the baby to like eat it or, I don't know, bang it or whatever. If I give an 18-month-old baby a shovel, I expect them to like scoop the sand with it, or let's say there's not even any sand, to sort of pretend to do some scooping motion with high probability. Not necessarily, but it's the sort of thing I would expect.
Because they have in the past seen people with shovels do that, or like do you have to like be doing it with? Okay.
Yeah, because they understand about what a shovel is and that it's this thing that people use it for.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that you can do the imitative thing. I think I would have guessed that like it's easy to learn to like imitate somebody who's right there. And it's like a little bit harder to realize, oh, in the past, I've seen people do this thing with this thing. So let's try that
and
out.
I think some imitative behavior happens very early. Like I think there's studies about like if somebody sticks their tongue out at like literal newborns, they're more likely to stick their tongue back. And I certainly have experiences of babies, like I try to make some noise and they try to make some noise back at me when they're very young. But it seems to come online in a more, I don't know, in a way that seems sort of distinct around 1. And again, I'm sure like other people have studied this. I'm mostly just saying based on what I've seen with babies. There's also something where like below a certain age, like, I don't know, below about other people's babies. I'm like definitely over-indexing on my own kids and kids that I've personally known. So it could be different. But I would say if I think of my kids, like, let's say they're 2, I expect them to be not that motivated by sort of what is socially normal, what is like the sort of vibes of the room telling me to do, compared to, I would expect that to matter much less than a kid who's like 4.
Okay.
That's another thing. This may be kind of obvious, but
yeah. So, do you think like this is like one way of thinking of this would be like whatever, like, I don't know, there's something about like your child which like just says like what things they find reinforcing, and like around the age of 1 it's like being able to imitate things that they saw in the past, and around the age of like 3 or 4 it's like um socially fitting in or something. And like one there's one version where I'm just like, well, I have no idea what causes that change. It's like an exogenous fact, or it's like just somehow programmed in genetically. um you could I could also imagine like trying to have some sort of operant conditioning story for why that changes. I'm wondering like
I think it's more like, I think it's basic. It's more like a developmental thing than like a programmed in genetically thing.
how do you what distinction are you pointing to there?
Well, like I think it matters what experiences people have had. Like there's something where, and in some sense, these concepts are hard. Like when I think of when do my children get teeth,
Yep.
I'm sort of like given a kind of, it's tricky. That's the sort of thing that I tend to think of as more, well, it's programmed in that they'll get teeth around this age. But then I'm like, okay, but of course it matters. Like, are they getting enough? Whatever. There are in fact a bunch of environmental factors that affect whether the kids get teeth.
Like how much calcium they have, and
yeah.
like,
Or like, I'm like,
having
okay, it
hard or
certainly
soft
sure
things?
seems like I'm tempted to describe eye color as like genetically built in, but like, but probably there's, if somebody doesn't get enough nutrition, then they, in the right ways, that they need some physical building blocks to produce those eyes, and they have to get them. And like in some ways it seems very natural to describe that as genetic, because my understanding about eyes, of course I could be wrong, is that the sort of things that would prevent a child from developing their sort of genetically determined eye color would also probably kill them. Sort of assuming that they're sort of alive and flourishing at all.
Yeah.
They probably have the color of eyes that could be very well predicted. Like in practice, if I look at people's genetics, it corresponds to their adult eye color with like a very high certainty. Whereas with something like height,
Yep.
Still a lot, but not as much. And I would say that given the sort of variance we actually see in the environment, it is pretty predictable that kids will do this at 1. But I think I could design in an environment where the baby was alive and not necessarily. But then even then it's tricky, because I'm like, I don't know, these babies in the Romanian orphanages that nobody picked them up, but they died a lot. Anyway, so sorry, I have trouble with this conceptually. I think that if I sort of look at the time series data, there will be things that I think could be described in terms of operant conditioning that will affect the course of things like imitative behavior developing. That said, do I think it's relatively overdetermined that the human will develop this way, and relatively overdetermined that the dog will not? Yes. So I don't know if that's an annoying answer or anything at all substantive.
It's kind of I think that's an interesting answer. I think one I guess one frame on the question is, you could imagine there being like an underlying reinforcing thing that like approximately at age 1 you figure out that you can get it by like shoveling with a shovel when you've seen people shovel with the shovel in the past, and approximately at age like 4 you realize that you can like get it by paying attention to social context, which is appealing for people like me who like there to be a one grand theory of everything. Or you could imagine like indeed these changes, they aren't built in, but it's something like, well, as long as you like get enough iron, that change in what's reinforcing will just happen, and it's not like a rational response to something. It's just like,
yeah, my guess is that things like imitative behavior, it is conceptual learning in response to previous experiences that tends to happen around that age. That, like, for example, I don't know, the baby discovers that it's sort of pretty low level stuff. I don't know, maybe they stick out their tongue when other people do and whatever, and that there's this attractor that's like, it's fun to do what the other people do, and it seems to get me more of what I want. That kicks in as a concept because they've sort of generalized it from enough specific examples.
Yeah.
And then they're like, all right, that's my new plan. Try imitating stuff.
What do you think it gets the baby?
I think there's something about this attunement thing that is pretty fundamental. And I don't know that I fully understand it, but like if you've ever hung out with a baby and they make a sound and you make a sound, often they'll smile. And like, do you know about the still face? Yeah, right. And you smile. Yeah, you like it too. Do you know the still face experiment?
No, I don't.
So this is, and as with all these things, you know, I'm not an expert in any of it, but I believe what it is you take a baby and a caregiver and you instruct the caregiver to do nothing, like keep their face as still as possible in response to what the baby does. This is quickly very distressing for the baby. They do not like it. They'll start by like, you know, in a sort of typical example, they'll start by cooing or like trying to get your attention. And then let's say you're not doing anything. And then they'll start crying and they're not doing anything. And they don't like it at all. Why? And then I'm like, okay, I don't know why or something. Like, I think I often come back to like, there's some theory where it's like, well, here's why it's sort of genetically useful. Here's why we would have evolved to whatever. But then I'm also sort of like, yes, but not like, to what degree is it arbitrary, or to what degree is like development of an agent have these sort of obvious attractors?
Yeah. I also wonder if it's like if I can get people, like suppose I'm at a very early age and I don't have like fine-grained control over my muscles, or I don't know how to like use my muscles to achieve like kind of gross motor tasks. If I can set up some sort of imitation thing that like, it's like an IO channel. It's like an input-output channel that I kind of have to like interact with the world. And I wonder if like just there's something rewarding about like either inherently about developing that, or you could tell some story where like developing that is useful for other goals. It's not so obvious that like on the second story, like how does a baby figure out that like it can get more treats by like getting the parent to like go ooh when the baby goes ooh? I don't know.
Well, but okay. I mean, I guess I'll try to tell a story. I think it's not. Let's say it's a very young baby and it's not treats, but there's sort of some question of like what is fundamentally reinforcing. I think something about food that seems pretty fundamental, right?
Yep.
And in fact, one of the things that like parents have to know when to feed the baby, right? And I think the more sort of high bandwidth communication there is between the parent and the baby, the more often the baby can correctly expect to get food when they want food.
Yeah. Or like sleep when they want to sleep. But like that's, I think this is a classic example of like babies being sort of unpredictable to parents.
Yeah, though, I mean, over time, less so, right? Like they tend to figure each other out. And other things, like, I guess when I think of like, what do babies want? There's another theory, some woman was on Oprah, Dunstan baby language. And she had a theory that there are basically like 4 or 5 types of baby cries. That they're sort of like vocalization combined with sucking makes a distinctive sound that means like hungry. Vocalization combined with, there's one that means like they have to burp. There's one that means like they have some sort of pain. I don't know. Like, and that there's sort of built in factors that are non-arbitrary, like the swallowing noise while crying. But then they get that. The theory is, and I don't know if this is anyone replicated this or anything, but that if the parents can actually learn to distinguish them, then the babies will start to make more distinct sounds on purpose. Even though it started out as a reflex and now the communication channel is better. So I guess it makes sense to me that it would be a very natural attractor, very young, that the baby's like, okay, good things are going to happen when like I'm calm and the parent is calm and there's like high exchange of information between us. And that this is a quite easy concept to learn and is in fact predictive of good things.
Yeah. It does require like, a baby to have a notion of calm, right? Which is not like if I have some like, if I imagine like it's not a totally obvious thing to mechanically define, right?
I think it is. I think, in fact, that, I mean, I could be wrong, but my guess is that, I don't know, there, in fact, are pretty basic statistical mechanical equations that go along with, I guess it's high parasympathetic, like low sympathetic nervous system activation. I'm not sure I'm right, but this is I bet a video camera and I like look at people's like little micro motions and I sort of
Yeah.
have the right way of like thinking of them. Like, I think people are intuitively very good at this. And I think dogs are too. Like, could a dog tell with 3 seconds of data whether a stranger approaching from, 100 feet away is calm? I think yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think they can. It's just like, there's this question of like how, uh, what does that tell you? Like, if it's the case that like it's really hard to define what calm is, but like babies know it anyway. That's like quite interesting, right? It suggests that like
Yeah.
somehow that's like
Right.
encoded in the genome or in like something is encoding that like before it gets out.
Right.
Um,
Well, or it learned it in the womb.
yeah.
I think probably a bunch of learning happens in the womb. Like, I think the baby learns a lot of physics in the womb and like a lot about how their muscles move and stuff.
How much
It seems like they would.
physics could you learn in the? I guess you could learn some like fluid
I think a lot.
mechanic stuff.
No, but they can move their limbs too.
Oh yeah, I guess he could like notice. Like you'd probably figure out which way is down, and like if you like untense your arm, it like goes down.
Yeah, I think stuff like that.
Hmm.
And if I had to guess, and this is, I don't know, sort of probably more on the crackpot side of things, but I think that there's probably, Prigogine?
No.
I believe he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for some sort of complexity theory stuff. My guess is that sort of calmness could be decently well modeled by some of that stuff. I've tried to, I don't know, read the Wikipedia articles and think about it, and maybe I'm wrong. But I don't know. I guess leaving that aside, it's just if I look at a person, I think tension is sort of obvious. It makes people jerkier.
Yep.
And I think if people are doing something that is smooth and like smoothly responsive to the environment, this is not that hard of a concept. And it basically means that they're calm.
Sorry, the chemist you mentioned, what was their name again?
Prigogine.
Prigogine. Okay.
He talks about dissipative systems.
What's a dissipative system?
Okay, so this is another thing that I think is very related to all of this. So it's and again, I'm not the best at understanding the math here, but so like an example that people often give for a dissipative structure would be like a tornado, or like a swirl in a water or something, where there's some structure there.
Yep.
But it's not like, I mean, is a rock a dissipative structure? I'm like, yeah, I guess sort of, but like that captures less of the intuition for what he's trying to talk about than some sort of feature of some like fluid system like a tornado, where there is something where like, I think the math is mostly just trying to say like, look, there's a structure there. Like it's not sort of random over time that if there's like, this is what it's like now, then in the future it'll also be kind of like that. And it's sort of responsive to the environment. So like if I imagine there's some sort of tornado and I perturb it with some bit of wind, it has some sort of like, if I believe part of the definition, I could be remembering wrong, is that if I add some sort of small bit of perturbation to the system, sometimes it can like incorporate that. But if it's too large, then it can't, basically.
Okay.
This just seems somewhat intuitive.
Sort of. And the idea is that like this is related to calmness in that like,
yeah, so if I think of a mind,
more reactive,
right? So like let's say I think of a dog that is somewhat stressed out by other dogs. Okay.
Yep.
Unfamiliar dogs on the walk. So I think that this can be modeled as a dissipative structure sort of thing, where the mind can sort of handle a certain amount of processing about other dogs, and if a dog is at sufficient distance, it can like incorporate that information and learn about the dog and sort of evolve to become a more, I don't know, like a more capable version of itself, where now it like understands better about other dogs. However, if it gets sort of overwhelmed, then by like the dog has now come too close, then it sort of can't handle it. And it could sort of totally break and the dog could kind of go crazy or whatever that is. But normally the thing that happens is that either the dog will sort of net shut down. I've seen this happen with like, with dogs, and the dog comes too close, like maybe it'll leave or like lie down and not even look at the dog or whatever. Sort of is like, or it will produce some very loud type of reaction, like the barking and lunging, which my model of this is something like offloading the processing to the external environment. Like now sort of something else has to change so the dog can sort of remain in equilibrium. Like maybe the animal will leave because it got loud, or maybe the owner will be like, okay, now the dog is getting loud, I will take the dog to a new situation. And they'll sort of regain their equilibrium that way, but not because of something sort of internal to the mind.
Okay.
Um, and yeah, I don't know. I think they're, again, my guess is the statistical mechanics could relatively well describe calmness as sort of like the mind has this under control and is neither sort of tensing up to shut down, nor is it sort of getting loud and trying to like be like, I can't process too much that way. I don't know. I think they both look jerkier. I don't know.
Mm. Okay.
And so this is why I think a baby could learn it pretty fast. I think any mammal could, and potentially even a non-mammal.
Okay. So I'm wondering, like, is there anything like in this like general space that you feel like is kind of a next step for you to understand, or like kind of open to you questions here?
Yeah, definitely. And one of them is I want to understand something about when does episodic reinforcement work and when does it not work?
Hmm.
Because it seems like conjugate reinforcement more like always has some effect. I don't know. I mean, assuming it's the right sort of whatever. I guess given a bunch of assumptions, it seems like conjugate reinforcement behaves in a more predictable way than episodic reinforcement, but sometimes episodic reinforcement definitely works and I want to understand it.
Okay.
That's one thing.
What's an example of episodic reinforcement definitely working?
If I say, hey, I'm going to post something on the internet for will somebody come feed my dogs while I'm out of town, and then afterwards I'll pay you. And then they do it,
Yep.
and then they get the money at the end. I mean, maybe there's some different way I'm supposed to conceptualize it, but it certainly seems like, okay, I'm using my concept of they did a thing, there's sort of a large chunk, and then afterwards I gave them something for that, and it worked.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess like for those kinds of things, like sometimes I'll imagine like different layers. You might imagine different layers of reinforcement. So the case that feels
Yeah.
salient here to me is like board games. So like going to Go, for example, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you play a game and then at the end you win or lose. But like normally you'll have a sense of like, okay, am I closer to winning or losing at any given stage? Right.
Yes.
And like part of your job is to develop that sense. But like I think a lot of the way people think about like getting better is like, okay, if I like make this move and then like it follows in this way, am I now like closer or further away from winning?
Totally. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess one story would be, oh, there's some like inner reinforcer that is actually like more conjugate. But that's
Yes.
a little bit mysterious, right? Like, what is this inner reinforcer, or how does it happen?
I mean, with the board game, like you can introspect on it, and it probably seems sort of right.
Hmm.
I would think.
I mean, I think it's yeah. I think it seems right, but still a bit mysterious. Or like
Yeah.
or like in that case, you're like, okay, there's this like internal, like the way I think about it in AI is like you're internally like you internally have this reward estimate that you're shaping using the value function, and you're saying like, okay, like this
Mm-hmm.
is like how likely I think it is that I'll win, and this like added some points, or this subtracted some likelihood points,
Yeah.
or something. And then like somehow that shapes your behavior either by directly reinforcing behavior, or you just like cognitively plan, or more likely you cognitively plan over things that like are likely to win. Although at some level, if something like looks really stupid and you feel dumb for playing it, like then maybe like that's just directly unpleasant.
Yeah. I mean, so is your question like, do I think that sometimes episodic reinforcement happens without that sort of inner conjugate structure supporting it?
Oh, it was less. It was less of a well-formed question than that, and more amusing.
Okay,
That
well,
you can
this is an
respond
open
to.
question for me. Like, I guess I'm not sure whether there's always some sort of underlying conjugate thing going on when
Yeah,
the episodic thing works. I don't know.
yeah. It seems less likely to be the case for like somebody like feeds your pets while you're gone and then you pay them.
Oh no, but no, I think that's not right. I think people have a bunch of sort of concepts of like that are relatively smooth, that are more like okay, I don't know, that are more like virtue ethics, basically.
But I don't think they're like if like if I like said, hey, I'll like do this for you. It's not the case that like
Yeah.
as I'm driving to your house, I'm like, ah, yes, this feels like I'm getting paid $1 per
Oh, yeah,
Mile,
totally.
like, get
No, but I
closer.
think, yeah, but there's some sort of abstraction where it's like, so let's say I were imagined doing it. I promised to feed someone's dogs and now I'm doing it. I think as I make the decision, like, okay, I'm going to get out of my house and I'm going to go, I'm like, all right, relief, because in fact, this was going to sort of nag at me until I decided, like, I made a plan that I believed in where I was going to do it. So I think I get relatively smooth relief from like, is now when I'm going to do it? Okay, yeah, I'm going to do it. I don't know if that describes your experience. I think it describes mine.
Maybe.
And then I go there and I'm like, okay, so I could either feed the dogs or I could, like, I don't know, take their money out of their wallet that I just found over there. And I'm like, no, but I have this concept about like integrity.
Yeah.
And it's like relatively smooth, even I think when I like, consider like move my eyes towards doing the thing that would obviously be wrong according to my values. And I'm like, no, this feels bad. That feels low integrity. Okay, I'm looking at like feeding the dog. Yeah, it feels like good. This feels high integrity. I don't know. This is kind of how I think it works for me.
I mean, if I wanted to be specific, I'd have to think about an actual thing that I like actually do. I have not recently like actually promised to feed someone stuff, but
sure.
I mean, I think a lot of that, like, I think a lot of that is just implemented in options that you like don't consider or never get close. So like, I don't regularly like, I don't know, I live in a group house, and it's not the case that when I get closer to stealing my friends' wallets, I start feeling a bit worse about that. It's just like, I guess I would think about it more cognitively as like, that's just not on my list of things that I'm considering.
Right, but I think the cognitive stuff is and so honestly, like, it's not like I get close to stealing people's wallets either, but like I think the cognitive thing often synergizes with like, in fact, that big behavior has been extinguished on like a more low level.
Yeah.
Where like it is in fact true that I remember I was talking to somebody about this. It was like that there's something uncomfortable for me a little bit, like in the way that you described, like, let's say you have your open drink and now you're tracking it. If like a friend of mine took, like $100 bill of theirs and like placed it in front of me, I find this somewhat uncomfortable. I'm like, okay, I have to remember that that's theirs. Like, I in fact would feel better if they put it back in their wallet. Like, not very much. Like, it's fine. I can remember it, but
yeah.
I think I see this sort of thing peeking out around the edges. Whereas in normal situations, I think it's the way I think of it is that it's more like, I just don't bother even thinking about taking my friend's wallet, because whenever I've done that, I'm like, nope, that's not what I want to do. And so I stopped doing it.
And I guess these things do gradually get extinguished. So like, I don't know, one like salient example for me is like, so I'm a vegan, and like at one point I didn't used to be vegan or vegetarian. And like currently, like, I don't know, I'll go to a restaurant and I'll like scan the menu for vegan options and like, think about those. And I wouldn't think like, oh, but should I get a steak?
Totally.
But like that there was like a transition to that period, right?
Yeah.
Where I guess like presumably like the reinforcer is I don't know, look at the other bit of the menu and then I'm like, that was a waste of time because I'm not going to get anything, or like, it's a little bit frustrating to imagine eating this food but I'm not going to be able to.
Yeah, and also then when the next time you sort of skip over it, then that's like, again, I think there's some tendency towards doing cheaper behaviors. And it's like more positively reinforcing when you're like, now I'm reading a thing that maybe I could have on the menu. Like, this feels good.
Yep.
And certainly, like, when I think of it, because I have had all these toddlers, I'm like, and it certainly doesn't come built in that people aren't going to like take the money that's right in front of them.
Yeah. Actually, that's actually also an example of having low level behaviors that like get reinforced like for efficiency and low energy expenditure. Like you get better at like reading ingredient lists and like skimming over them, and like the word gelatin popping out at you, or like immediately going to the end where they have the allergen list and like one of them is eggs.
Yeah, and I think people also have like aesthetics for this, which is sort of like some kind of relevance for like which information should be elevated, which is like likely to be predictive of something else. And then like, I've thought about that. I play this. It's pretty popular, so maybe people know it. There's a tower defense game called Bloons. And I was sort of trying to unpack, like, okay, what's exactly going on when I play this? And I have some sense of like, all right, well, if I have like, and the towers are different colors and they make different noises when they pop the balloons. And I'm like, if I'm hearing too much of this, like, I don't know, like pointy sound, then I got to make sure I have something to handle the lead balloons. Or like, these things seem like they're too wizardy, which in my mind is coded as purple, even though the towers aren't exactly themselves purple because they can't pop the purple balloons. Like, I got to add something. Like, I don't know. This whole thing is sort of silly, but like, when I introspect into these processes, it does seem like there are these relatively smooth gradients a lot of the time underlying what seems like more discrete or conceptual stuff.
And for people who don't know tower defense games, at least where I'm used to, there's some like winding path where like things are entering, and then eventually they like the end of the path is like your house or your castle or whatever, and you don't want them to enter your castle, and like you put little
Yeah, you have
things
to
on the
destroy
way.
all the enemies.
Yeah, and you put little things next to the path that will like shoot enemies when they come, and you can pay more for better things. And so that was one question. Like, when does episodic reinforcement work, and like how is there like an underlying, when is there an underlying conjugate reinforcer, and like how does that happen?
Yep.
Wondering if there are other like unknowns.
Yeah, and so another one is something like when is it, like some better theory than I previously, like I have some physics analogy, but some better and more complete theory of when is this kind of operant conditioning frame likely to be useful. And yeah, I don't fully know, but certainly sometimes I have the sense in my interpersonal relationships that this would be like, I think there are some sort of anti-inductive factors that play into this that make it more obvious that sometimes it won't be useful. In particular, like the one that I think I already named this previously is that at least humans, and I think sometimes animals too, have something like a desire for autonomy.
Yep.
That I think means some sort of like, okay, I'm going to track, are you doing something that where now my behavior is going to be too predictable or too sort of under your influence, and now I'm going to do something to make it, even if it's like not better in any other way, it's better in that like you aren't controlling what I'm doing. Probably you're familiar with this.
I have definitely had this motivation. Yes.
Do you remember there's a Slate Star Codex thing about, I think it was in the post about, I don't know, like in Cultural Wisdom and some book he read about that, where he's talking about how it can be helpful to sort of randomize where to hunt so as to not like deplete hunting grounds too quickly or stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
And he said that there's a result that humans are pretty bad at generating random numbers as judged by like, can the computer suss out their pattern?
Yep.
And like, yeah. But he said that there was one guy that was good at it. I don't know if you remember this. It stuck with me.
Yeah.
And this guy could be, and somebody asked him like, what are you doing to generate these numbers? And he was like, well, I'm using my free will.
Yeah. This is a Scott Aronson story, I think.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah. Probably quoted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, this is an example of the anti-inductive, like this free will is partly this anti-inductive thing where people are willing to insert randomness or try to be unpredictable on purpose because there are things about the higher level dynamics they don't like when other people can influence their behavior in predictable ways. Like if, in the obvious example, if I like want to be a champion of rock, paper, scissors, the thing I don't want to do is be like, okay, well, I've like done some sort of analysis of the population and scissors wins more than anything else, so I'm going to always play scissors. Yep. Like that's clearly wrong.
Yeah. Although, like this desire for autonomy, it's not the, like, you do want to be, you do want there to be some ways in which people can influence your behavior. For instance, it's nice if you can be paid to do stuff. But like, it seems like there's a desire for that to happen in certain ways and not in other ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, like I think integrity pushes in the other direction, right? This pushes people towards being predictable.
Or also just the, like the desire to get to interact with people.
Yeah, that's right. I think there are like this sort of attunement attractor that I'm talking about. I think is often also like about being. I think there are many factors pushing people to be predictable. There are many factors pushing people to be sort of more easily influenced by various types of low-level operant conditioning, and then other ones pushing them away from it. And sometimes some of them matter more. Sometimes people's sort of internal plans are more coordinated, and sometimes they're more uncoordinated. And anyway, so yeah, I don't have a complete theory of that. And then another open question, and I'll try to not make this too long. I sort of have an ongoing complaint about the way people often talk about game theory, and then people have told me that I don't really understand the true sophisticated things people are saying about game theory, which is almost certainly true. I am not very well versed in the academic literature. However, I certainly have some experience with the way people anecdotally talk about game theory, and I think I have a pretty strong objection here that people seem to be talking about a lower dimensional thing than is almost ever going on in real life.
Yeah. That's
And
definitely like one story here is like game theory. Like the reason game theory got invented is that the U.S. wanted to like do a good job at winning a nuclear war, or like
yeah, but it
maybe
didn't
not
even
invent it,
work,
and it
right?
didn't even work. Yeah, like
I mean, I guess it sort of worked in that, we're not all dead of nuclear weapons, but like some of the very obvious things that one might think would be a consequence of these game theoretic insights did not happen, right?
yeah, they ended up just not using it very much. And
Yeah.
and yeah, it I notice that like it often gets deployed in ways that seem strange or sort of myopic to me. So like sometimes
Yeah.
people talk about prisoners' dilemmas, right? Where like basically there's some way of like you can do something that like makes your life better and the other person's life significantly worse. And the other person could do the same, such that if you both refrain from doing the thing, call it cooperation, then you both would be better off if you both did the thing, which we call defection. But like each individual person has this incentive to defect, and
Right.
therefore like you end up in this like defection state. And like there's a lot of analysis of like how to get to cooperation, and people think about it. And like the classic example, like the reason it's called the prisoner's dilemma is that the example given is the case of two prisoners who have been like arrested on suspicion of some crime, right? And
Yeah.
like the police like separate the two and put them in different cells and say, hey, like I want you to confess to this thing or like rat out the other person. Like if the other person rats you out, then like if you rat out the other person, this is just going to be better for you either way. But of course,
Yep.
it's going to be worse for you if you get ratted out. Um,
Yes.
and like in this example, the pro-social thing to do is to rat out the other prisoner because it's good for the world if laws work,
Oh,
right?
yeah, in that sense, sure.
like
Assuming it's a just law and a just government,
yeah,
and
assuming that it's a
enough.
just enough law and a just enough government. But I feel like there's often this
This
like
is sort of newly relevant to the EA space, perhaps.
yes, I have two acquaintances who were charged with financial crimes, and one of them ratted on the other, which I think was the right call, basically.
Seems right to me.
But we should have a positive term for it. I like rats, so let's call it ratting out. But like, yeah, like I don't know. A complaint I have with this is it feels like sometimes people like identify one thing, like simplify it down to a game, and then forget that the rest of the world exists, or be like, oh, we've got to cooperate because cooperation is good, and like for like I don't know. Sometimes it feels like these things can forget that there's like a wider world out there.
That makes sense.
That's
To
my
me.
rant about this. But
Okay, so
I'm supposed to be interviewing you.
no, I like it. I guess I'll try to. This is. I don't know how much this will come across as relevant because these ideas are still half formed. But I think this deal about sort of whether people are calm, whether the operant conditioning channel is sort of high bandwidth, is a thing that really, I don't know, like if the I want it to be more a part of how people think about the things that people are now thinking about game theory and decision theory in a more discrete way. Like with decision theory problems, I'm like, okay, so people have talked about with Newcomb's problem, there's like, you could assume one of the constructs is assume that there's some agent that knows exactly what you do. This is assumed, right?
Yep.
But in fact, this is sort of an artificial situation. And then I've seen other people be like, okay, but let's say, like at the beginning of this, I was talking about Paul Ekman. He can, oversimplification, but he can tell whether people are being honest by looking at their micro expressions. And I think the Parfit's Hitchhiker.
I do, but let's tell our audience.
Yeah. So this is maybe you should say it in case I get it wrong. But it's like, let's say you're in a desert and you want somebody to take you somewhere and take you out of there, and you're like, I'll pay you once you bring me there. Am I saying this right?
Yeah. Somebody happens to come across you in a desert with a car, and like but they're kind of a sociopath or something. They like don't want to pick you up, and so they're like,
Right, which is already a weird assumption, but yeah, let's say we go with it.
yeah, or like I don't know, maybe they only have so much space in their car or something, and like it's
Sure.
gonna like actually be costly to them to pick you up,
Yes.
and such that they'll only do it if you pay them like $100, and you're like, well, I don't have $100 with me, but once I'm in the city, then I could go to an ATM and get you $100.
Yeah. But then once they drop you off, you could also leave.
Yeah.
And the idea, like, I think many people who've thought about these sort of things are like, well, it's better to be the sort of person that would follow through, because then you could be the sort of person, where the person will actually take you out of the desert.
Yeah, especially if the person is Paul Ekman and they can tell if you're...
Exactly, but this relies on the person being able to trust you. And I think in practice, I mean, it's an empirical question, but humans, according to me, there are various mind states where humans are, in fact, very good at evaluating these things about each other. And I don't know. Yeah. So again, I don't know that I can fully tie it. This feels like an open question in me. I suspect there's some better theory of like these sort of when are these micro operant conditioning things happening? How? And then what sort of structures, sort of intermediate structures do people have, and how could people detect them? And then what enables the sort of information transfer where it becomes sort of more like, I think there's sort of an attractor in mind space where I'm like, okay, I'm just going to be the sort of person that I would want to be if, like, I don't know, my husband could read my mind. Because in practice, we talk all the time. And like, it's very costly for me to keep secrets from him. Like when I learned about decision theory, and then I have these things where like, okay, I'm at a party and there's no exact agreement, but he's like, come home. Can you try to come home by about midnight unless you're having like a really good time? And then, whatever, do what you want to do. And then I want to sort of converge between, okay, would he sort of agree to me going to parties the amount that I want if I made these sorts of decisions? And I'm there again, I think there's a natural attractor where I'm modeling it as he can see my decision-making process. And I think it's correct to behave this way when it's my husband, with whom I have a very high trust relationship and with whom I communicate constantly.
Yeah. And I think, like, perhaps getting to your complaint, in classic game theory models, you don't necessarily assume that you have a communication channel. It's not obvious that the equilibrium will be for honest communication over the communication channel, rather than just like you say random things and the other person ignores it. And it sounds like you want something with that like more built in, especially with like less voluntary.
I want a better theory of this, and I suspect that I don't know, there could be a theory of this that ultimately like unifies the sort of lower level operant conditioning stuff with then what leads to the sort of things where people do different sorts of decision theory things. I don't know.
Okay. All right. So those were two sort of things on your wish list of developments and understanding of like things roughly around operant conditioning. Is there anything else?
There probably is, but nothing comes to mind in this moment. Those are, yeah. I'd have to think about it longer to see if there are other ones, but there's a lot I don't know, so probably.
Okay, that seems very fair. I guess to wrap up, if people are like interested in Divia Eden thought and want to like get more of it, is there something they should do?
Well, I'm on Twitter. That's probably the place I'm mostly on these days. Divia Caroline is my Twitter handle.
Okay.
So that's, yeah. If anyone wants anything more, I do have a website, becomingeden.com, but I haven't put anything there in ages.
Okay. Great. Well, actually, before we wrap up entirely, I'm wondering, is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you wish I had?
Yeah, nothing comes to mind at this moment. I appreciate all of your questions.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for speaking with me, and to the listeners, I hope you found this episode enlightening.